Well, I'm David F. Roberts. I'm the organizer of this event, the chairman and founder of the African Caribbean Sustainability and Investment Summit. The reason we're here today is basically to bring a number of the excellent advocates in the reparations movement from around the world to discuss a method or a pathway to get to an understanding of how young people can get involved in this movement, how we can have a structured and useful approach to the discussion of reparations, reparative justice for a global audience. So we're going to be here just going through various discussions, taking viewpoints from different sides of the argument and being responsible and kind about it.
There's going to be lots of emotions, and what we're looking to do is to speak about reparations not just from the side of money, but from equanimity for all. So today is going to be a lot of parliamentarians, we're going to have business leaders, and we're going to have authors, scholars alike, all discussing a topic which we need tangible outcomes for, not just vented frustrations.
And we should have been having this conversation years ago, some would even say decades ago, but it's good that we're having it now. It's great that we're actually having it in Parliament, in the House of Lords. You know, one only looks at this particular issue, you look in history and you see how Parliament, how the establishment had a massive role, both in terms of perpetuating transatlantic African chattel enslavement, but also its abolition. And this whole issue of reparations, I believe, is one that Parliament needs to engage with, civil society needs to engage with. I personally work for the church, and the churches really need to be a part of this as well, because in many respects, the church has provided a spiritual and moral justification for the enslavement of Africans. I mean, the churches are keen to talk about the work they actually did in ending slavery, but they need to recognize the other part, their complicity in as I've said, providing the moral and the spiritual justification for this. So it's a conversation really for society. And also I think the good thing about this is we recognize the international dimension to this particular issue. So it's not just about Britain, it's also about Europe, because we know that Europe was complicit in all of this. Clearly there is an African dimension to it as well, and also the Americas. So it has to be joined up. It has to be concerted. We need to recognize the damage that was done to people of African heritage, to Africa, the legacies of that in the Caribbean, and also the effects of that in this country. So yeah, it's great that we're having this conversation. It needs to continue. So it's not just about today, it's about outcomes. It's about what do we do? How do we take this conversation and ensure that the things that we're discussing become tangible in a way that makes a difference to the lives of people living today, but also those who come after us as well.
We're looking at reparations together rather than individually. And I think it's the togetherness, Africa and the Caribbean, I think it's the togetherness that will make a difference. So I'm really expecting to take part in the discussions and also to learn from my colleagues about how we can together, make a difference and, make some kind of progress on this very important topic.
Good morning, distinguished guests, esteemed colleagues, Your Excellencies, global leaders, and some people, unfortunately, that I call friends. It's my honour to invite a long-standing, effective, influential Member of Parliament, she hasn't paid me to say this, who happens also to be a very good friend of mine. She's going to be giving the opening remarks for this conference before we come on to the wonderful David. Baroness Verma, the floor is yours.
Adjustment of microphone because I'm short. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Attlee Room in the House of Lords. Actually, it's a real timely debate for what's going on around us in the country, but also globally. I think this debate should spark off, I hope, an honest and candid discussion about where we go forward. whilst we can talk about world reparations, what we want to really do is get to the nuts and bolts of how do we change the narrative to the direction of travel we want to take. And that takes many shapes and many conference discussions. But if we're not honest and candid in a room in the oldest parliament on the planet, then where will we be? Yes, of course, we can pick knots in lots of things that have happened, but what we can't change is always best to see how we can make something better going forward so we don't roll back and have the same problems again. And the sad thing is, the sort of conversations that are going on globally at the moment actually frighten many of us that are in politics, because it seems that we can't be free to actually say some of the things that need to be said. And unless we have these honest, open discussions, you know, what we'll end up doing is the silent good will be left out of the debate, and the loud, noisy people who know how to get the stage and the attention of the microphone will take charge. And I always find that a dangerous place to be. I was talking to somebody earlier from my own home city of Leicester. You know, some of the stuff that we're seeing today was playing out when I was a child in this country in the 1960s and 70s. And it was a tough, tough time to be a kid of colour. And for those of us who grew up in that time, we worked incredibly hard to have a positive discussion about value, about respect, about trust, about what we give rather than what we take. Now, we're sitting in the Attlee room, and behind me is a portrait of Clement Attlee, one of Britain's biggest social reformers. His grandson and I are actually very good friends, and if he was to walk through the door, you'd think a ghost has walked in because he looks exactly like him. But one of the things that I've learned being 19 years in this place is the effective change that you can make if you utilise the voice of politics properly. And that means holding people to account who claim to represent you. So as thought leaders, and those of you who do know me, I do a lot of work in the developing nations, particularly in Africa. I have incredibly good relationships with thought leaders across that continent for one purpose and one purpose only. It is the continent that has the most to give, but it's also the continent that has not been able to get itself going for itself. And I think the one thing that when Mr. Trump, President Trump, said he was taking away US aid, I asked my African thought leaders and leaders what they thought. And they said that it's time for Africa to decide Africa's future sense of direction itself, not tied to people giving it things for particular things. I think that's a brilliant way to look at where we're going. And so I think today, and I'm going to leave the conference for all of you to decide what the outcomes will be. But like Chris, who's a brilliant, brilliant speaker on environmental issues, particularly, but you do. You raise things about the ocean. Now, if we don't look after our land, our sea, and our air, the problem is all of us will be complicit in leaving a world that is incredibly toxic for the next set of generations. And that's a duty we behold on ourselves. So as a parliamentarian, I work to try and raise issues. I have always been outspoken when I need to, because I think my job in this place is to set challenges, to accept challenges, not just politically, but socially from you guys too. And you guys, you're the thought leaders that are going to take the ideas back. And it's not a day just for us to beat ourselves and say, oh, whoa, how everything is so bad. Because for every one bad thing, there is 10 opportunities on the other side. And I want us to be able to explore those. So the topic is an interesting one. I did tell David that, you know, I'm going to listen carefully. By the way, you'll see me in and out. We're in recess. So I've got several meetings going on all over the place. So you'll see somebody like me flit in, flit out, but I will know from David what the outcomes of today's conference will be. So thank you all very much indeed.
As Baroness Verma said, it's a very heavy topic. It can be, but it also can be a topic that comes with solutions. I think today's conference is very, very timely, considering the climate outside, considering the climate in the air, not physical climate, but this feeling. And I think today we're going to make progress. So a little bit about myself, just to give some context of why I'm standing here. Not that I'm dressed greatly. I mean, thank you. Yes, thank you. Okay. So my name's Kridikel Truthbey, and I'm honored to serve as your moderator for today. This is the launch of the ACSIS World Reparations Conference. By background, I'm the founder of the Value Foundation, which is a global non-profit, and we work internationally on sustainability, justice, and inclusion. Currently, we're in 33 countries. So I've got a good taste of the world in that respect, and my family actually hail from Uganda. So I'm proud to be here today, David. Thank you. I also stand here, more importantly, shaped by that heritage and upbringing, because I don't just come from one continent. And I think if we look at this planet, we look at the history, we like to pigeonhole ourselves. We like to say we are a male from this country at this age. And I think now we're getting to the point in society where we need to stop pigeonholing things, because life's not that simple. And this conference today and the topics aren't that simple. They don't have simple solutions. What we don't want to do is vent frustration, even though this is a very frustrating topic. We want to come up with tangible solutions. And I think solutions is the only way forward. So my family actually hail from Uganda, India, Jamaica, Germany, Scotland, and the United Kingdom. So if you want to see the look of the future, right here, tan skin, green eyes, thank you. It reminds me daily that all our histories are not neatly separated, but they are intertwined, and that the legacies of empire, slavery, indenture, colonialism still live with us today. We are living examples of the just not so far past. The theme, truth, dignity, and repair for generations to come, I think is really, really important. And it reminds us that this isn't an easy conversation about that past, but this is a conversation about the living present and the futures that we're shaping right now. I speak on this topic with a heavy heart. I believe none of us truly can begin to comprehend the atrocities of what has happened to previous generations. When David asked me to moderate this, it actually petrified me, to be honest, and I don't think many people wanted to take this job. But I'm going to try to do my best, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to urge everyone to not make conclusions and reflect before reacting. I want everyone to take steps to have tangible outcomes, not just frustration, which I know it is very frustrating. When slavery was abolished in the British Empire in the 1830s, it was not the enslaved who were compensated, but the slave owners themselves. A little known fact that the government borrowed £20 million, and that's around 40% of its annual budget in those days. So you can work out what that is today. And they actually paid the slave owners for loss of business. What's kind of shocking is that when do you think that debt from the 1820s, 1830s was repaid? 2015. Oh, I love this audience. So taxpayers in this room have still potentially been paying that money just a decade ago. So we can look at this as a very current topic, a very recent topic, and I think that is the truth. The truth is the story doesn't end there with emancipation. Slavery comes in many different forms. For example, after the abolition, Britain turned to another system, which I'm sure Priya knows very well, and that was indentured labour. Does everyone know about indentured labour? So between the 1830s and early 20th, more than 1.5 million Indians were shipped across to the Caribbean, Africa, and the Pacific under contracts that offered opportunity but delivered very, very harsh oppression. The conversation's not just about money, race, creed, but I want to open it up to give equity and to give equanimity to everyone that's involved in this. People were displaced, dispossessed, and dehumanized, all in the name of business and empire. So today we're going to hear from voices from across the globe. David's done a phenomenal job at curating a lot of influential people, even sitting in this room. It's quality, not quantity. And they're from politicians, business leaders, faith leaders, advocates shaping legal and moral pathways for justice. And this alignment reminds us that reparations aren't confined to one people or one place, but it's intergenerational, it's international, and it's an urgent call for justice. So as we begin, let us commit ourselves to truth, to dignity and repair, as the name of this conference is. I thank you all for being here, and it's my privilege as well as my honor. And I really do want a big round of applause for David Roberts to deliver the official opening remarks.
Thank you, Chris, for that very warm welcome. And he's right. It was extremely difficult to find an event moderator that would take the reins of running this conference today. Distinguished guests, Baroness Verma, the event sponsor, friends all. This is a very, very difficult period for me in terms of the launch of the World Reparations Conference, because I grew up in the Caribbean, as you may have discerned from my accent. I lived in a few places in the Caribbean in the 70s and 80s, and the topic of reparations wasn't something that was prevalent. As a matter of fact, it was something that your parents made you ignore. Your parents felt that that's not your business. Your business is to go to school and learn to become a good employee and go out into the world and sell your labor to people who would respect you for the moment. But it was only as I got here 25 years ago, I realized that the experience of Caribbean people is very different to the experience of Black people in Britain. And then I started reading about the riots and all of that stuff, and I realized we had it good in the Caribbean. When you think about it, comparatively, we had it good. But there is still that mindset among Caribbean people at large that reparations is an issue for those people, not us. And so there's not a lot of effort being put into it. And I could imagine the challenges that Sir Hilary Beckles faces today. He's one of the most prominent reparative justice advocates in the Caribbean. And Vereen Shepherd, another stalwart in that movement. So I thought, as a Caribbean person living here in the UK, still holding on to that Guyanese, Grenadian, St. Lucian accent, that I should do something about bringing global players together so that we can have a coordinated, structured approach to this discussion. And I've been fortunate in this endeavor to enlist people from the United States, from Jamaica, from Ethiopia, and all over Britain to make this thing possible today. So I thank you for taking the time, especially those very busy faith leaders and academics and the descendants of enslavers, to share with us today what I expect will be a really rewarding, enlightening, and respectful discussion on how the future can be shaped and molded by us. That was my preamble.
Here we go.
Here we go. So how long must truth wait before it is met with justice? The call for reparations is not new. Marcus Garvey warned us that without dignity and sovereignty, no people can be truly free. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of the fierce urgency of now. Malcolm X demanded that we address not only civil rights, but human rights. Nelson Mandela, Desmond Tutu, and Steve Biko reminded us that reconciliation without justice is incomplete. Today we commend the scholarship and activism of contemporary leaders such as Sir Hilary Beckles, Vereen Shepherd, my old Guyanese ancestor, Bernie Grant, many of you would know Bernie Grant, and of course Esther Stanford-Xosei, and many others who have carried this struggle into our century with courage and clarity. Yet even as their voices grow louder, the resistance grows sharper. The Trump effect, and I'm quite sure we all know who this Trump is, magnified by figures like the late Charlie Kirk and echoed by UK right-wing rhetoric, has normalized division, fanned the flames of racism, and emboldened hatred. We see it in policy, in politics, and tragically in violence. Consider the recent hangings in Mississippi, a grim reminder that terror against Black bodies has not been confined to the past. Here in Britain, King Charles has acknowledged the pain caused by slavery, but acknowledgement without apology is unfinished work. We cannot overlook that the UK government remains silent, unwilling to meet the moral responsibility history demands. And so we ask, why does the West, nations that speak of democracy, liberty, and human rights, continue to harbor such hatred and fear toward Black and brown people? Why is justice delayed when truth is undeniable? The African Union and CARICOM have set a clear framework for reparations. It is about repairing the past to create a just future. They remind us that reparations are not charity, but justice owed. They demand restitution, rehabilitation, and guarantees of non-repetition. Their leadership shows us the path, but it is our collective duty to walk it. This launch of the World Reparations Conference is more than a symbolic event. It is an invitation to organize globally, to align our advocacy, to amplify our scholarship, and to connect our movements into a force that cannot be ignored. We must ensure reparations become a pillar of international justice, not a footnote of history. So let us ask ourselves, as we leave here today, how can the World Reparations Conference make a meaningful difference? Not in words alone, but in action, in policy, in lives transformed. So let's have a good day of respectful dialogue, and I thank you.
Our next keynote comes from a powerful voice in the UK reparations discourse. She's been a champion for justice and equity, both in Parliament and in communities across the country. So I would like a big round of applause. Let's welcome Belle Ribeiro-Addy, Member of Parliament. Thank you.
I'm very pleased to be with you all today. I'm very pleased that we are talking about this subject in this house. There is no more place, I believe, that is important to talk about this subject, especially when we look towards policy. And I always like to begin with a truth, and the truth is that there are no words or no payments or no collection of acts that could ever fully recompense for centuries of crimes committed against people of African descent. These crimes of enslavement, genocide, ecocide, colonial plunder, deliberate underdevelopment, and neo-colonial chains that still bind many nations today. And the reason for that is that these crimes were too great, their impact was just too fast, and it's important that we acknowledge that even as we start to look down the road to repair. But if we do nothing, if we deny repair, we're actually just continuing the crime. And that's one of the reasons why I'm proud to chair the all-party parliamentary group for African reparations in this House. And it's very important, as I said, that discussions like this are had in this House, because it's policy from this House that leads to the actual actions of repair. And there are many, many discussions being had in many different places across the world, but there's no more important places than in houses of parliament like this across Europe. And what we're doing is we're pushing for policy, for legislation, and ultimately for justice. But I want to be clear that even though it's important that this conversation happens here, and I'm having it here and others are having it here, the struggle didn't begin in Westminster. It's been carried on for generations by grassroots activists, elders and movements, and all of them refuse to be silenced. And it's very important that we remember their existence. Because as we move forward to having these discussions in larger forums, sometimes I know that they feel quite forgotten, those grassroots activists, as we're moving forward in a way that I know may be more palatable. I mean, we're talking in the House of Lords at the moment, a very, very distinguished place. And for some activists, they may feel a bit shut out. And we also have to remember that as we continue these discussions, to remember the root of what they were calling for. And actually the root of reparations itself, and that it should always be on the terms of those that were most impacted. The problem is that when I think about all of the struggles that we've overcome as people of African descent over hundreds of years, it always seems to get to a point where we no longer have control or agency over the final outcome. So when I think about how the transatlantic slave trade ended, many will hear, and when I call for reparations, one of the things that I hear is that I should be grateful because Britain brought an end to the slave trade. Should be very, very grateful. We did that. But we have to remember why the slave trade came to an end. It came to an end because it was no longer economically viable. It came to an end because those who were enslaved were revolting. They were the agents of change. And Britain, there were activists here as well who came along, but it was ultimately them. But we're meant to believe that freedom was a gift. And I think about colonialism. I think about all of those different countries that fought and struggled for the right to govern themselves. They fought and struggled for that right. And just when they got to the point where they actually won, and countries like our own could no longer force governance on them, we had our royal family members going over there and having ceremonies to hand over power to them. Again, their freedom was a gift. So when it comes to reparations, we have to make sure that its delivery is not considered or is not given out in a way in which those who are most affected do not have control, because it seems at every single point in time that control is taken away and that agency is taken away. Now, I say that because things such as investment are meant to be a part of that agency and a part of that justice, but ultimately it has to be about repair. Now, I'm very pleased in terms of the work I do in this House to stand on the shoulders of Bernie Grant, the late great Bernie Grant. He was a member of Parliament, and one of his most courageous acts was actually founding the African reparations movement in the UK in 1993. He was the first person to actually bring the argument for reparations into this House. And he was the first person to ask for an apology for the transatlantic slave trade. And the work of the APPG for African reparations continues with Bernie Grant's vision, but it also builds on the countless work of community organisers and campaigners and everyday people who have never stopped resisting, who understand that we have to start with that recognition of harm, an apology. And what I've noticed about an apology, because a few years ago I asked for an apology myself, to which I was told that we shouldn't unpick the past. An apology is accountability, and that is why governments dodge it. I've seen that in this country we offer deep regret, which is a really, really strange phrase for one of the worst crimes in history, in my view. When I talk about deep regret, the example I usually use is Woolworths, but I've noticed speaking to some young people, they don't know what Woolworths is. I was really upset when Woolworths closed. I deeply regret that it no longer exists, but I think you're all old enough to understand that. But you cannot use the phrase deep regret for one of the worst crimes in human history, and they call it a stain on history. It sounds so insignificant when you put it that way, but they won't apologise. And they won't apologise because an apology means liability. Liability means accountability, and accountability could ultimately mean reparations. And another thing that happens is we're always told to forget. Why are you trying to dredge up the past, unpick history, as I was told? And I find that so strange because I look around places like this place that I work, and we love history. We love history, we love remembering, we have remembrance days. We in this house, we keep everything exactly as it was during a time of history. Modernisation is a difficult thing to do here, but peoples of African descent are always told to forget. And that has to be wrong. I want people to understand what reparations is not. Reparations is not charity. It's not aid. It's very clear that reparations should be justice, about repair, about moral, social, economic, and environmental imbalances, and repairing those that persist to today. And another thing I'm always challenged on is that reparations is aid. Why are we paying reparations when we've already paid so much in aid? Now, aid could not possibly be reparations. It could not possibly be reparations because it's something that is given on the terms of the individual country or organisation that gives it. As well as that, aid has very much become an industry. It is an industry, it has its own educational programs. We've got even more and more private companies engaging in this industry. And what does every industry need? Supply and demand. And what is that demand? The impoverishment of people. So unless NGO aid organisations' ultimate aim is not profit, but to bring an end to its own organisation, then it is as much a part of the problem as anything else. And that's why it hasn't worked. And we challenge that as regularly as we can, without trying to look down on some of the good work that has been done, but ultimately recognising that we have to move beyond aid. We also talk a lot about restitution. I think that's really important. Returning what was looted, those artefacts, and that is as much about dignity, treasures, and yes, of course, the bones of our ancestors still being held in European museums. And an example I always like to give to people is how would you feel, or what would you think if Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, who recently departed, may she rest in peace, was dug up and taken to another country and put on display, or her bones left in a box? We would all recoil at that. But that's precisely what has been done to people of African descent, African kings, queens, freedom fighters, ancestors. Their bones are literally sitting in boxes across Europe. Their skulls are in jars. And, Dons at Oxford once drank from the skull of an African woman. So they're defiled, dehumanized, and actually denied dignity, even in death. So this is one of the reasons why we've begun work on the Laying Our Ancestors to Rest report. And this is an aim, from our perspective, to change the law on selling human remains, because it seems that dignity is reserved for some and not for all. And as I said, there are many different ways in which we could go about reparations, which are not solely about money. Whenever we talk about money, people's eyes glaze over, or they start talking to me about the challenges that we already have in this country. And I understand that we have challenges in this country. As a member of parliament, I get emails about the challenges every day. We are asked to debate them all the time, but that doesn't negate us from our other responsibilities. Now, we need to also recognise the issues that are happening with the climate change. And as much as anything, climate breakdown is the one single issue that affects everybody across the world equally. In that, well, not equally, but it affects everybody across the world, whereas not every single issue affects everybody across the world. Now, the richest nations are responsible for half of all historic emissions, and it's clear at the moment that they are severely damaging certain nations in the global south, and all that while they continue to steep them in debt, and whilst not allowing them the economic freedom to be able to solve those issues. And again, when this so-called aid is given, it's often sticking plasters and not actual real solutions. And that's why reparations matter. It has to be more than finance, but a systemic overhaul. In order for us to actually see true repair, we need to dismantle the structures that capitalism built, the structures that were imposed purely to keep some countries in a certain position, the structures of trade, finance, and governance that were literally built to enrich countries like our own and impoverish others. And we have to do this because that's the way that we get to equity. When you break down these structures and allow more equity in terms of global finance, things change. Because at the moment, when people talk about people of African descent, it's often as a collection of problems, a collection of problems for the West to solve. But has anyone ever thought that people of African descent could be very much the solution to their own problems if only equity was the goal? If you give everybody what they're owed, if you give everybody equal measure, if they had fair access, things would be different. And one of the other issues that we really, really try and impress upon is education. And I think education is crucial. I always say that I'm asked to speak about things in regards to reparations quite a lot, but I would never consider myself an expert. It's not possible for me to be an expert. It's not possible for me it's not possible for many people to be an expert on the very basis that we have been told so many lies about ourselves that every time you go somewhere and perhaps you talk about this subject or generally about things that have been left out of world history, you learn something new. And I think about the lies that we're generally told and the lies that we're told about ourselves in this country. And I think that as someone who was born in the UK, I was essentially given what was considered a world-class education. But I never knew, now only just in my 40s, learning that the Berlin Wall was greater than the Great Wall of China. Or that even right down to my own heritage, my Ga Dangme heritage from Accra, that they actually had stone houses and buildings when the British came. It was yet another thing that was destroyed when the British came. And I remember in this place where I had this world-class education, going to Ghana for the first time when I was 5 and coming back and excitedly telling all my friends at school about it, only to be asked about my mud hut. So that is how deep this distortion runs. And you think that decades later, that perceptions of Africa had changed, and they haven't. And we need to think about how urgent it is that we correct this record, because at the moment we are teaching artificial intelligence all of these lies. We are teaching artificial intelligence all of these lies, and it will soon create many, many more issues in terms of discrimination as we move over to many more of those systems. So all of these things that we are talking about, we have to be very clear when people try and tell us that they are crimes of the past and that we should forget about them and that we should look at them in a slightly different way, that they are not. They are very much alive in our present. They live in the poverty we see in certain countries. And actually, they live in the structural racism that we see in institutions in Britain, in our banks, in our cities, in our universities, that were built in stolen labour and stolen resources. And they even live in this house. I always say that I walk past on my way to work, walk under the paintings and past the statues of people that probably own people who were enslaved. There were at least a minimum of 50 members of House that were involved in this. And also the idea that reparations couldn't be possible. When slavery was abolished, Britain didn't pay the enslaved, it paid the enslavers. Many of you will know this. 300 billion in today's money, paid off by the British taxpayer as recently as 2015, which means most of you, who I'm sure are law-abiding taxpayers, would have contributed to. And that means that also descendants of the enslaved and the Windrush and generation literally helped pay for the oppressors of their own freedom. So the argument that reparations are impossible actually collapses under the weight of history, because Britain has already paid reparations, it just paid them to the wrong people. It's clear that the issue is not whether or not reparations can or should be paid. It really is a lack of will. It's a lack of will and a lack of political will, particularly, but also an issue of trying to point to other countries' own problems. Now, I'm not saying that no country that may be calling for reparations has their own problems, and I'm not saying that none of their problems have anything to do with their own governance. But the reality of the situation is, how can those nations, knowing what we have done to them, how can they fight some of the crises that they face today with one or both hands behind their back? And that is the legacy of enslavement and colonialism. These nations were left shackled by loans, stripped of land, deprived of control over their resources. And we have to realise that despite it all, despite everything that has been done to these nations, not because of anything we have done for these nations, some of them are still rising. And I want to think about that word despite as I come to a close, because one of the arguments that I like to make, because I think it's important to make the moral one, because I hope that people are moral, but for those who don't see the moral one, I like to make the economic one. Our government successive governments, actually, I won't even just blame my own, panders to nationalism. And we need to do well to remember that nationalism is not a uniquely Western concept. Many of the countries in the Commonwealth and others who were exploited will only remember, and their children will only remember, a present in which they were subjected to punitive IMF conditions, crippling their social infrastructure, and it to serve the interests of more powerful countries like our own. These countries have their own nationalists, and every one of them would ultimately tell you that the things they are achieving are in spite of Britain's atrocities, not because of aid or the privilege of being colonised. And as their economies change and as things change, we need to look at the world in a slightly different way. In some years' time, 1 in 4 people in this country will be over 65, and 50% of the world's youth will be on the African continent. That is going to change the world order. And I want to understand that whilst we are here increasing our defence capabilities and doing all of these things, I want us to think in this country about who really avoids harm. We've got to make sure that we have strong defence. We've got to make sure that we have this because, we might be attacked. And I think to myself, who doesn't get attacked? People who have friends don't get attacked. Why would your friends attack you? But we don't seek to go out into the world and make friends because we seem to have this idea that in order to maintain our position, it has to be one of dominance. And I would argue that it has to be very different. We are told that our biggest threats are China and Russia. But what are China and Russia doing? China and Russia are all over Africa and the Caribbean. If your enemy is doing something, or your proposed enemy is doing something, you might want to look at what they are doing and why they are doing it and understand a bit better. So I think we have to have a different approach. And yes, there's a moral argument, there's an economic argument. If we do not start down this road of making friends, actually, I don't know what it looks like for us in the future. Now, I'm often told that I shouldn't be arguing for reparations as a British member of Parliament because what about my own constituents? And I'm very clear that I think it's as much about their future as anything. I'm a daughter of Africa, obviously, but I'm also British, and some people argue that you can't say that you're both, and I believe that I'm both. In an increasingly globalised world, my type of identity is not just possible, it's actually inevitable. And I can also love my country, this country, but also be very clear about the fact that my country is wrong. My mum loves me. She tells me I'm wrong all the time. And I think it's really important that we understand that this idea of patriotism has to be more about flag waving and going along. It has to be thinking about the future for people. So it's not unpatriotic to criticise your country. Blind loyalty does not make sense to me. And yes, I think about motivations as well. The reality of the situation is if we don't create a world in which everybody that looks like me is respected, that means people that look like me in this country, no matter what position they might hold, will also not be respected. And that's as important as anything else. So, whilst I'm continuously told that the fight for reparations is one that we'll continue to talk about and there is no hope in it, I like to remind people that my life, if anything else, is an example of how things change over time. In this place, women couldn't vote, I think about 100 years ago. Black people, peoples of African descent could be owned, but here I am, a member of Parliament of African heritage, and as I said, I walk past those statues and those paintings of people that once said that I was mere property, and I get to call for reparations. So I believe genuinely that as long as we continue the struggle, one that is rooted in the grassroots and one that understands that the ultimate aim is repair and equity, that things can change. Thank you.
Well, what can I say? I mean, repair and equity, these are the two things I think we've been looking at this entire conference. So that was an amazing speech. it always does remind me, to be honest, a few things that you said really resonate. That I remember coming back from Jamaica with my dad, and he turned around and said, Jamaica's a Chinese loan. And I didn't understand it at the time until I then started looking into these things. And it is so true that these nations are having influence all around the world. So without further ado, we're going to watch a short video and then we're going to go for a recess. So thank you for your attention. Thank you for your input. We're going to do some Q&As as well. We really want to get your opinions on these topics because the part of having equity means that everyone has a say, everyone has a voice.
Greetings, beloved. I am grateful to be here with you today. My name is Dr. Kridikel Truthbey Desire. I am a policy analyst for the 6th region, and it's an honor to present to you a restitution. I first want to say thank you to each and every single one of you who join us here today at the first World Reparations Conference, hosted by the African Caribbean Sustainability and Investment Summit at the House of Lords. I want to give also a special thank you to CEO and organizer David F. Roberts for putting us all together. Built in Marblehead in 1636, the 120-ton Desire was commonly believed to be one of the first ships to bring enslaved Africans into the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Built to serve many purposes, the ship carried passengers, trade goods, and supplies through the Atlantic world. It also served to traffic in people. The papers and journals of John Winthrop, which provided only information of the vessel and connections to the slave trade, detail some of the vessel's journeys. In July 1637, William Pierce, master of the Desire, left the Massachusetts Bay Colony for Hispaniola, there to sell into slavery 15 native boys and 2 native women, captured in a battle near what is called now New Haven, Connecticut. In February of that next year, Pierce and the Desire returned from Providence Island into the West Indies, into a country now called Haiti, with a full hold of some cotton, tobacco, and some Negroes. I stand before you today not only as myself, but as a living descendant of those who were bound in chains and carried across the Atlantic. Good ship Desire bear my family name. My ancestors arrived on these shores in the U.S., aboard the good ship Desire in 1636, under the command of William Pierce, landing in Boston. They did not come to seek opportunity, nor did they come freely. They were bought here as chattel slaves. My family voices were silenced, their names were stripped. My ancestors' humanity was denied. Yet our resilience has carried forward through the centuries, and it is by my ancestors' unbreakable spirit that I am able to stand before you today. When I speak, I carry them with me. Their story, not only my story, but it is a part of American history. I would like to discuss with you today a very important document that was written by the House of Congress in 2008. It is called House Resolution 194. H.R. 194 is a federal resolution that was drafted in the 110th U.S. Congress, passed by the House of Representatives, sponsored by Senator Stephen Cohen. H.R. 194 is a resolution apologizing for the enslavement of racial segregation of African Americans under the U.S. law, more specifically for slavery and the Jim Crow laws that followed. It also acknowledges that slavery and Jim Crow were fundamentally unjust, cruel, brutal, dehumanizing, and their effects continue to linger. It also commits in rectifying these lingering consequences, and for those misdeeds, and preventing similar human rights violations. And it is before you today that I have the honor to read House Resolution 194, to not also remind us of this federally important document, but to also attach restitution and the corresponding Haitian resolution, H.R. 1804, will both be presented in Congress 120. 120th Congress, which will be in 2026. Both resolutions recognize not only the moral obligation, but also the legislative responsibility. The amendments put forth total $5 million per descendant of chattel slave, a figure not arbitrary but emblematic, intended to reflect the seriousness of debt owed and the magnitude of repair required. House Resolution 194. In the House of Representatives, U.S., July 29th, author Stephen Cohen. Each of these lines represent a amends mandate figure of a dollar sign of cash payments that is owed to each descendant of chattel slave. Whereas millions of Africans and their descendants were enslaved in the United States and in the 13th colonies from 1619 to 1865. Price tag, $300,000. Whereas slavery in America resembled no other form of involuntary servitude known in history, as Africans were captured and sold at auction like inanimate objects or animals. Price tag, $300,000. Whereas Africans forced into slavery were brutalized, humiliated, dehumanized, and subjected to the indignity of being stripped of their names and heritage. $300,000. Whereas enslaved families were torn apart after having been sold separately from one another. $300,000. Whereas a system of slavery and visceral racism against persons of African descent, upon which it depended upon, become entrenched in the nation's social fabric. Price tag, $300,000. Whereas slavery was not officially abolished until the passage of the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution in 1865, after the end of the Civil War. Price tag, $300,000. Whereas after the emancipation from 246 plus years of chattel slavery, African Americans soon saw the fleeting political, social, and economic gains they made during Reconstruction eviscerated by virulent racism, lynchings.
Family in Mississippi is now begging for answers after their 21-year-old was found dead hanging from a tree at Delta State University. Campus police say the body of 21-year-old Trey Reed, a black student, was discovered by staff members on Monday morning.
So what we're seeing right now is that they're claiming that there has been a lack of direct communication from law enforcement, from the university to the family on the day this incident was discovered.
Family does not know exactly what happened on September the 15th of 2025. We are seeking answers. The family of Trey Reed has not even received a phone call.
Students on Delta State University's campus react to Cleveland Police Department's ruling of Trey Reed's death.
I don't have much of an opinion on the autopsy. I'd like to think that they aren't lying, but considering the history of Mississippi, it's hard to be sure.
Lynchings, disenfranchisement, black codes, and racial segregation laws.
Oh yeah! I'm saying, what you saying? Oh yeah, for? I'm not, oh my God!
Fuck up!
Okay, down, oh my fault. Oh my God!
You want it again? No, man. Shut the fuck up. You was big and bad. Shut your bitch ass up.
That imposed a rigid system of officially sanctioned racial segregation in virtually all areas of life. Price tag, $300,000. Whereas a system of de jure racial segregation known as Jim Crow, which arose in certain parts of the nation following the Civil War to create separate but unequal societies for whites and for African Americans, was a direct result of racism against persons of African descent engendered by slavery. Price tag, $300,000. Whereas a century after the official end of slavery in America, federal action was required during the 1960s to eliminate the de jure and de facto system of Jim Crow throughout these parts of the nation, through its vestiges still linger to this day. Price tag, $300,000. Whereas on July 8, 2003, during a trip to Gorée Island, Senegal, A former slave port, President George W. Bush, acknowledged slavery's continuing legacy in American life and the need to confront that legacy when he stated that slavery was one of the greatest crimes of history. The racial bigotry fed by slavery did not end with slavery or with segregation. And many of the issues that still trouble America have roots in the bitter experience of other times. But however long the journey, our destiny is set, liberty and justice for all. Price tag, $300,000. Whereas President Bill Clinton also acknowledged the deep-seated problems caused by the continuing legacy of racism against African Americans that began with slavery when he initiated a national dialogue about race. Price tag, $300,000. Whereas a genuine apology is important and necessary first step in the process of racial reconciliation. Price tag, $300,000. Whereas an apology for centuries of brutal dehumanization and injustices cannot erase the past, but confessions of the wrong committed can speed racial healing and reconciliation and help Americans confront the ghosts of its past. Price tag, $300,000. Whereas the legislature of Commonwealth of Virginia have recently taken the lead in adopting a resolution officially expressing appropriate remorse for slavery, and other state legislators have adopted or are considering similar resolutions, price tag, $300,000. Whereas it is important for this country, which legally recognized slavery through its Constitution and its laws, to make a formal apology for slavery and its successor, Jim Crow, so that it may move forward and seek reconciliation, justice, and harmony for all of its citizens.
Murray scolding a student found on school property after hours. Shows Ahmad Williams waiting in the principal's office. He's exchanging words with school resource officer Steve Shaulis.
Man to man, bro. I'll do if you're 14 years old or not. I will punch you in your face.
Price tag, $300,000. Be it resolved that the House of Representatives acknowledges, number one, the slavery is incompatible with the basic founding principles recognized in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. Number two, acknowledges the fundamental injustices, cruelty, brutality, and inhumanity of slavery and Jim Crow. Number three, apologizes to African Americans on behalf of the people of the United States for the wrongs committed against them and their ancestors who suffered under slavery and Jim Crow. Number four, it also expresses its commitment to rectify the lingering consequences of the misdeeds committed against African Americans under slavery and Jim Crow, and to stop the occurrence of human rights violations in the future. Number five, the persons described in House Resolution 194 shall receive reparations or restitution cash payments in a total of either $5.1 million or $5 million, which is the total of the 5 resolutions. The persons described in House Resolution 194 shall receive any parcels of land totaling up to 60 acres at the location of their choice. Was originally 40 acres and a mule, but even that has not been given. As we move forward to the Republic of Haiti, Parliament Resolution number 1804 to be presented in Congress 120 in 2026. A resolution acknowledging historical harms, offering an official apology, and establishing a national reparative justice program. The United States has a heavy hand in current Haitian situation in politics.
Why don't you give back the money? I think it would be a great gesture. Well, because she takes a tremendous amount of money, and you take a look at the people of Haiti, because what's happened in Haiti with the Clinton Foundation is a disgrace. And you know it, and they know it, and everybody knows it.
Thank you, my fellow Democrats. Thank you, my fellow Americans. We've done things to help small businesses and agriculture.
It's 2010, former President Clinton publicly apologized for forcing Haiti to drop tariffs on imported subsidized U.S. rice during his time in office. The policy wiped out Haitian rice farming, seriously damaging Haiti's ability to be self-sufficient. This is the president apologizing at a hearing before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. At the time, he was the UN special envoy to Haiti.
We rich countries that produce a lot of food should sell it to poor countries and relieve them of the burden of producing their own food. So thank goodness they can leap directly into the industrial era. It has not worked. It's maybe been good for some of my farmers in Arkansas, but it has not worked. It was a mistake.
There's no reason why Haiti should be importing rice. The rice grown in Haiti is much healthier. Ever since this rice has been coming in, there have been diabetes epidemics. People didn't used to have that much diabetes. This is the worst thing that could have happened to Haiti.
Bill and I have been involved in trying to help Haiti for many years. We've done things to help small businesses and agriculture.
It was a mistake.
Because of the iridium and the natural resources that Haiti has, more than any other country in the world. And it is because of this clause that the United States, along with France and Canada, decided to rob and pillage Haiti's gold in 1914 and in 1915 built its wealth upon the gold in Fort Knox in the United States. Therefore, the House Resolution 1804 shall reflect the same restitutive justice. In January 1804, Haiti declared its independence, becoming the first Black republic and ending chattel slavery on its soil. Whereas in 1825, France imposed an identity on Haiti as a condition for recognition, triggering a century of debt, extracting finances and dependency in a tune of over $300 billion. And because of this, the tune of $5.1 million per descendant of chattel slave from Haiti is also requested. An issuance of an official apology is also requested to the Haitian people. To also establish a national reparative justice program, a 3-year pilot to finance targeted community-led repair across all 10 departments. And finally, to set investment priorities for all those who were affected by chattel slave, not only in the U.S. and the Caribbean, but globally. To invest in education and skills, teacher training, youth entrepreneurship, invest in health and nutrition, clinics, mental health, and maternal care, to invest in housing and community infrastructure, safe water, sanitation, and resilient housing, to invest in rural economy and food systems, farmer co-ops, storage, and irrigation, and finally, culture and memory archives, to preserve the legacy and to never forget the history that we have been through so we can never repeat it again. And this concludes our restitution presentation on how amends is needed in coinciding with this very important apology that has been federally documented. And it is from the UK that the United States was born and therefore bears the responsibility globally for us to see this restitution paid in full. A sincere thank you again for allowing us to present a very important need to bring restitution and repair to such an ugly history, but we can make it better by teaching our children that we are all created equal and for them to see that is so.
Grand Rising, Ethiopian, African family, both at home and abroad. In the presence of the Most High, the great order divinity, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, we bring you peace and goodwill. I am Ras Paulus Hoshing. I'm a baptized member of the Ethiopian Orthodox Tawahedo faith, the same faith of His Imperial Majesty, Emperor Haile Selassie. I'm also the chairman of the Ethiopian World Federation Incorporated Charter 43, 6th region, here in Jamaica, West Indies. I'm also a member of the National Council of Reparation. And as you know, family, since 1838, from emancipation, we, the Black people of the world, has been seeking reparation. We have seen how the enslavers were compensated and became rulers of the Caribbean under the palpable doctrine of their democracy and their system, that we cannot find justice in the land of our ancestors. So I must commend Brother David Robert and his organization for this wonderful gathering, which is very historical, because it's under the House of Lords that created policies, these laws against our people, we, the Black people of the world. This is why, since 2015, the CARICOM region has been united, particularly Jamaica, that made a governmental decision, unanimous, for the pursuit of reparation, the repayment, to restore all the evil, the genocide, all that was committed against the African people. So my family, this gathering is very historical, because it's finally give us the opportunity to declare our position of sovereign authority. We are into restitution, what we have lost and what they have stolen, particularly our land. Because in order to save ourselves and our future generation from being annihilated, we must reclaim our land. And this is the position, family. So I wish you well at this wonderful gathering, and I look forward to the true Africans coming together under the sovereign authority of His Imperial Majesty Constitution that was written in 1931 and revised in 1955, that covers an entire empire right in the Caribbean, north of the equator, the 6th region. So we're looking forward to the disclosure and the action that will be taken from this gathering. I wish you all well, family. In the name of the Father, in the name of His Son, and in the name of His Holy Spirit. 1 in 3, 3 in 1.
So my name is John Dower. I am descended from the Trevelyan family. In fact, my great-great-grandfather, Charles Phillips Trevelyan, was a member of Parliament here. I was always told by my family that we were more affiliated with the great and good, the abolitionists of the world, the philanthropists, and the people doing socially good things. So in 2016, following reading an article by David Olusoga, which suggested that anyone who was descended from the landed gentry, was affiliated with the upper class, the middle class, should really go to the Legacies of Slavery database and check out whether they had any ancestors who were involved in plantation slavery. I sort of went, okay, I should do that. And I thought, I won't find the Trevelyan name in here, because I've always been told by my family that we're not associated with this terrible thing. I clicked on the name and suddenly came up 6 plantations in Grenada and 1,004 enslaved people for which my ancestors had received compensation. And the world fell out. It was an incredibly life-changing moment. And I went through various stages of anger, fury, upset, shame, guilt. And what I did do was I convened the family, and 7 years later I found myself in a packed room in Grenada, which is early 2023, presenting an apology with my cousin Laura Trevelyan to the people of Grenada for what our ancestors had done. And I think it's really, what Belle said really resonated with me. Apology is accountability. And I think that's what we were doing, actually, when I think about it, because no one from the Trevelyan family had ever taken any responsibility for what they'd done to the people of Grenada, to their descendants of the enslaved. And I think actually that's what we were doing when I think back on it. It was a very powerful, as you can imagine, moment. I think it was very emotional for the people in the audience, some of whom forgave us, some of whom did not forgive us and were very angry. We got various sorts of responses. I'm not surprised. I understood the resentment. And since then, I've become more and more involved in preparatory justice from a campaigning point of view. A few months later, I was co-founder of an organisation called Heirs of Slavery. Heirs of Slavery is a group of a loose affiliation of descendants of enslavers. We have two main functions. First is we are here to support, encourage, educate, and generally inspire other descendants of enslavers to come forward and get involved in preparatory justice. And we do that in the form of having workshops. We have people here who've spoken at workshops, for example, Esther here spoke at one of our workshops. So we've had, and we consult with descendants of the enslaved to tell us what they think we should be doing. The second purpose we have is that we are also a campaigning group, and we want the government and the King to get involved in preparatory justice in the form of at least acknowledging that they should talk to people like CARICOM, the African Union, the diaspora in the UK, members of the Commonwealth, leaders. I have to admit we're having a lot of struggle with both of these ambitions. I'm going to be honest. It's not been an easy ride so far in terms of trying to persuade descendants of the enslavers to come forward. I think that hopefully this panel will tease some of the reasons for that out. We certainly haven't had luck so far with the King or the government. We know the King is basically on side, or at least that's the feeling we get, but we also know the King is not going to do anything without say-so of the government. So we're in a bind there. But anyway, now to my fantastic panel. I invited these three because they all come with a different perspective on this conversation. I'm going to ask them to briefly introduce themselves one by one. Maybe I'll start with you, Katerina. Okay. So Katerina is an amazing journalist working with Reuters, but also is descended from, as she will tell us a little bit, from Portugal, a Portuguese family that had links with Angola. So what would be great is if you could just give us a couple of minutes, just an idea of where you're at, why you're here, really, Katerina. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, John, for the invite, and thank you so much for the organization of this event. Very glad to be here. So yes, John said, I am a journalist and I'm also a descendant of enslavers. I found out about this family history when I was about 18. For into context, I'm 33. And when I was 18, my grandma on my mother's side, in a very kind of informal conversation at home, said that some of our ancestors were involved in transatlantic trafficking of enslaved people from Angola in West Africa to Brazil. I think at 18, when my grandma told me this story, to be completely honest, it wasn't very, and I tried to be as transparent as possible, I wasn't very shocked. And the reason why I wasn't very shocked was because as a teenager, I always questioned, where did this money come from? How did you guys lead such wealthy lives when you were in Angola? And secondly, I was 18, young, naive, a bit ignorant, really. And I couldn't really grasp or fully understand, that what my ancestors did beginning in the 18th century until, 1840s, that it still had an impact today. They really came. So sometimes people ask me, why did you expose publicly what your ancestors did? And I think they only came with knowledge. It was knowledge, right? It was after speaking to people who are still affected by the legacies. It was after reading a lot beyond what the Portuguese curriculum taught me that I started to realize that this was a very important conversation to have. I'll just to finish up, I think it's very important as well to think, especially with Portuguese families, Portugal enslaved 5.8 million people, right? That's more than any other country. Britain enslaved 3.2 million. And this is not a numbers race. I'm not kind of doing a numbers game to say who is to blame more, because even if you enslave one person, it is a crime against humanity. But it's just to put it into context, right? This conversation in countries like Portugal, in countries like Angola, in countries like Brazil is very, very important, and is not happening. So basically what I did with this story, family history, was to make it kind of my mission to talk about it. But also, as a journalist, I started to cover the reparations movement, and that's what I do. I write about reparations in the UK, in the Caribbean, and across the African continent, and I think that's kind of my little contribution to what is a very wide and strong effort across the globe to fight for justice. Yeah.
Thank you, Katerina, and that's why I wanted you here, because I wanted to get the perspective from another country which is struggling even more. We'll tease that out a little bit more in a second. Paul Lashmar has written an amazing book, which you have in your hands, sir, so I think you should just... There it is. He's written a book about the Drax family. I've read it. It's an amazing history, social history, political history of the last few hundred years of British history, but also of Dorset. But very much focusing on this family. So, Paul, I know you're not knowingly a descendant of the enslavers, but maybe you'd just like to introduce yourself and tell us why you're here.
Okay. Well, I'm here because you invited me. And I'm very pleased to be here. It's been a journey. I'm a boy of empire. I grew up in the 1950s, and what I was taught about slavery was how great Britain was. That yes, we had this sort of, we were involved in some slavery at some point, and then we abolished it. And not only did we abolish it, we had the West Africa Squadron that released it for other nations that weren't as civilized as us. And that's what I grew up with, and that permeates. And over the years, I've sort of got past that a bit, but I haven't really thought it through a huge amount. I've done a few things around the issues of enslavement in the past. And then I had one of those moments, I should say I'm a journalist, academic and author. My job is to find out things, tell the public so that they can make informed decisions. That's my job. And every so often as a journalist, especially as an investigative journalist, it may be years apart, you start on something and you have no idea where it's going to go. And I had one of those moments in June 2020. In June 2020, I was on my way home. I live in West Dorset. And on my way home to West Dorset from coming from the London direction, I was going past a very long wall. It's a very famous wall, it's known as the Great Wall of Dorset. And that's where the Drax family, or more correctly, the Plunkett Ernley Earl Drax family live. Now, I didn't know anything much about them. I'd just been listening to Radio 4, and the Radio 4 programme was the news at 1 or something, and they were saying, oh, there's been this thing in Bristol where they've thrown a statue of Colston into the harbour. So I was mulling that over, and I was going past this wall, and I thought, doesn't the Draxes have something to do with slavery? And I thought, perhaps, what do I know about him? Nothing. That's funny. So he's got this wall, it's got a lot of land. What's all this about? And that was the start of a journey. Now, this is a journey that involved a lot of research, but it's been, I think, quite a revelation to me, because I've learned a lot, and it's made me think hard about lots of things that I think I needed to review, and I think an awful lot of people in this country need to review. It started as a piece of journalism because I was at university, I was head of department, but I've started to look at this Richard Drax fellow, and I thought, well, firstly, what does he actually, what did the family own? And it turned out they owned a lot, and quite a long way in, like I'd started in June, it wasn't until sort of about October that several people pointed me in the direction that the family might still own a plantation in Barbados. So I luckily found someone in Barbados who helped me, and we were able to reveal in the Observer newspaper on the front page and inside that, in fact, the Drax family were unique. This was the family that is at 1627, which is about one of the earliest dates in enslavement history for the British Empire. They had James Drax and landed in Barbados and has cut out what eventually became Draxhorn Plantation. Now, he was with others, those names, and some of those names are named, but they are unique, is that they are the only family who still own a plantation from that period. And I think that's a sort of important part of this process, because when you're looking at heirs of slavery and you start to look at who has responsibility, it gets complicated. But with the Drax family, it has the advantage as a case study of sort of laying the basic guidelines of what has happened over the last 400 years. And along the way, it dawned on me, thought too, this is a book. So I did with my colleague Jonathan Smith at that time, I did about 14 stories in the first 2 or 3 years. And then I started writing the book, and I contacted Richard Drax, but I'll talk perhaps more about that in a minute. So I spent the last few years, and the book was published this year, and it seems to have gone down very well. It seems to have hit a nub. But I think what's important, it opens up. One of the things I hear, and I've seen this from people around Richard Drax and elsewhere, is you can't rewrite history. Well, I work in a university, and every day I'm surrounded by people who rewrite history, because we find out new things and we reevaluate things, and we say, well, this may have been acceptable in 1890, but it isn't anymore. And we think about these things. And the idea you can't do that, either rewrite, which is really saying we can't think about it, we don't want you to think about it. So that what the book is a challenge to all of that. And it's, and it's been a big challenge to me. I've had to really think about my emotional involvement in all this, what it means, and what it means about the empire and the country I live in.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll undoubtedly tease more about Edward Drax out in a second. Last but not least, James Christie Miller. You're not only a documentary producer and director, but you also have an element of this story in your family. So you could tell us a little bit about that.
Of course. Thank you, John. And thank you very much for having us all here today. My reparations journey is quite young in comparison to many of you guys, and it's still very much ongoing. But I had a similar experience to John a couple of years ago, where I rather casually, having read an article about the British Legacies of Slavery database, I rather casually went on and just thought, what happens if I put my family name in? My surname is Christie Miller, and it turns out that actually we were German. It was Müller. So there's another whole reparations story there to tell. But then I put my mother's family name in, which is McBarnett. And it came up, to my horror and shame, with over 440 people enslaved in St. Vincent, which I never knew about. I had no idea at all. And it was a real life moment, where you think, why was I never told this by my family? And what can I then do about it? Because it's bringing up lots of feelings, and none of them were at that stage very positive. And so I then teamed up with a documentary director, Tamara Gordon, who started making documentaries in the area of truth and reconciliation in the 1990s with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. So she has a real history in reconciliation and reparations and restitution. And we went to St. Vincent. We secured documentary financing to get to St. Vincent. And we took the approach that we were going to try and get to grassroots, to try and meet people whose ancestors were enslaved by mine on the plantation sites that were owned by the McBarnetts, by my ancestors, to acknowledge and to apologise. And I felt very importantly to then ask them what individual act of repair might be tangible, it might be worthwhile, might be meaningful. And so we teamed up with family historians in St. Vincent, And we also had an amazing guy called Vincent who works for the sewage and water works. And when he's traveling around the island, he's been GPS mapping all of the plantation sites. And he's putting that into a database, which he hopes will be made public. So he knew where every plantation site was. The first one was called Wallalabo Bay, which is on the leeward side of the island. And it turns out that that was actually just a raw valley. There's no one living on that land now. And then we actually went down to the bay. And what's curious about it is there's a big sign saying, "Welcome to Wallalabo Bay, home of the Pirates of the Caribbean." And it's where they filmed a lot of key scenes where Johnny Depp came in on that first film on his funny little ship that sank and he stood ashore. And there's still a kind of fake film set there now with the customs house and a fake noose and fake stocks. And 2 busloads of German tourists came in and started taking selfies in the noose and in the stocks. And I said to Vincent, do they know that literally just there was a plantation, a former slave plantation? And he went, no, of course they don't. They've just come off the cruise ship. No one's going to tell them that. And so that was an interesting experience. But then we went to the windward side of the island, to a village called Diamonds, which was on a plantation site that, to me, had the very grotesque name of Sans Souci, which in French means no worries. And that was where there were over 350 people enslaved by my ancestors. And we met, as we were in the village, we met a guy called Denniston Douglas, who was one of the senior members of the village committee. And he told me that they all know their history, because when slavery was abolished, they weren't going to be given the nice, fertile plantation valley. So they had to go up to the hills, and they formed a community called Lively, where they remained until the 1970s. And so therefore they all know their history. And Denniston said to me, I know that your ancestors directly enslaved mine. And I acknowledged the crimes of the past and the crimes of my family and apologized. And then he said, which was very, very humbling, he then said, but don't worry, James, because we've been waiting 190 years for someone from your family to come and talk with us. So let's work something out. And the next day he arranged for us to come back and meet with the entire village committee. And again, I acknowledged and apologized, and I then asked them what they felt could be an act of repair, an individual act of repair that I could do that could be tangible and worthwhile and meaningful. And we've agreed that we're doing a twinning project with a school in Hove to bring resources and funding to their primary school in that village. And that feels small, and I know it feels like another aid project, but it feels like the beginning of something. It's also the school where my mixed-race grandson has just started, age 4.5. And so it feels like there's a connection there, and I hope that this will be a lifelong project, that this will expand beyond the documentary. But I also feel that the documentary hopefully can be part of the reparations in terms of opening up a broader conversation.
Thank you, James. So, just a quick round of questions before we open it up to the floor. We haven't got long, so please make your answers as brief as you can, even though this is a very complex subject. So I'm going to ask you, Katerina, why is Portugal not engaging with this question? I mean, I know that Britain is not engaging with it as nearly as much as we would like, but how about Portugal? I get the feeling from talking to you it's not really, and why might that be?
Thanks for the question. I think there are various reasons, and I think before I answer this question about why they see so much silence in Portugal, it's important to acknowledge that the silence or the noise that exists currently in Portugal is very much thanks to the anti-racist movements there. They've been really fighting really hard with very little resources, but they're really doing what they can. And there are things happening in Portugal, like the new slavery memorial was going to be built in Lisbon, and if it wasn't for these anti-racist movements fighting, there will be no conversation at all. So there is something, but more is needed. And I think there are various reasons. One of the reasons is quite clearly, and like in the UK, is lack of political will. Right? I remember last year I asked the president of Portugal a question in the press conference, and I asked him, do you think there's a need for repair? And he said, yes, I do think, and I quickly went home and I wrote the story, and it came out and made headlines. And the conversation was very quickly shut down, by the government, which has executive powers, but also by opposition parties. And when I say opposition parties, it's not just the far right, You didn't see left-wing parties saying, wait a second, maybe this is something too that we should discuss. So yes, lack of political will definitely is one of the reasons. And then the other reason is that the past continues to be massively glorified across Portugal. The history is framed as a source of pride, of national pride, of identity. The so-called navigators, you see statues of the navigators everywhere. I mean, you go to a shopping mall in Portugal and you can see ships on the walls, and the shopping malls are named after these navigators. So it feels like we're clinging to this past, a past that people believe that was great, a past where we owned half of the world. A past that was quite vast. Our national anthem in Portugal is called Heroes of the Sea, right? So this is very present in people's day-to-day lives. And I think, like in Britain, one of the reasons why it's so hard to confront this past is because if you confront a past like this in Portugal, you're going to have to confront the fact that Portugal was built on the backs of enslaved people, that the wealth of the country was built on the back of enslaved people. And I think the elite of the country is not really ready to have that conversation because they benefited from it themselves. And lastly, and I could go on and give you a lot of reasons, but lastly, I think it's important to speak about education. Our education system in Portugal is not educating young people, young leaders with knowledge of the past. Just to give you an example, history books, fifth grade history books in Portugal still describe enslaved people as goods, alongside sugar and coffee, so as a commodity. So that hasn't changed either. So yeah, I think those are kind of like the main reasons why the conversation is not happening in Portugal. But once again, it is slowly starting thanks to the anti-racist movements, and hopefully, they can lead us on this path where the conversation can carry on. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that. That's very interesting. Paul, we've had a couple of co-founders of Heirs of Slavery in the form of David Lascelles and Charlie Gladstone, who are descended from big families who've got involved pretty actively in reparatory justice. What about people like the Draxes of this world? How do we get to them? How do we change the conversation in order to be able to bring people such as them on side?
With great difficulty, I have to say, because my relationship with Richard Drax, who's effectively, he was a Conservative MP until last year. He lost his seat in elections courtesy of reform. And my relationship with him has been very limited, and when it existed, it's been difficult because I started doing this as a journalistic thing. So I wrote to him from the Observer articles saying, can you tell me how much land you own, and why, is it correct that you actually personally own a plantation still in Barbados? This was not a great start from his perspective. So I sent him a list of 30 questions, of which he answered 3. So in every article, as a journalist, you put the key points to the person and say, what's your response? And when you're asking difficult questions, it becomes emotional. They don't think, oh, this is just a person doing a job. It all becomes you're negative, you're against my family. It's all that kind of stuff, usually. So when I came to ask him if I was told him I was going to write the book, I said, look, I know you're not going to like this, but I'm going to write a book about the history of your family because I think it's important. Can I please have access to the archive that I know is in your mansion? And I sent him an email and I sent him a letter. He has never replied to that. So he's only ever replied to very pertinent, basically journalistic questions. And I can only speculate as to what he thinks and the way he does it, because I'm not in his head. So what I would say is he takes the view that the best thing to do is lie low. Wherever possible, lie low, don't get engaged, don't encourage them, is the way he views this particular thing. And why does he think this? Well, the experience of his family over 500 or 600 years is they control all the levers of power. For 500 years, they've been MPs, justices of the peace, they've run the militia, they've been in the army, they control things. And they do that by just getting on with taking advantage of that situation in many ways for their own interest. You don't get to own 23.5 square miles of Dorset without having some leverage, and another large estate plus a plantation and all of that without you taking advantage of that power that it's given. What I'd also say is that so you can be fairly certain that you've got a fair amount of control over events, and that's why I think a lot they would take the view that for 500 years they've held solid, they know what they're doing, and if upstart journalists and others come along and try to disrupt that, then the best way to deal with it is to ignore them. I think that is a fairly coherent approach that you see from a lot of other people. This brings me back to a point I was talking to John about earlier. I don't have, as far as I know, a legacy in slave ownership. I do not know either my English or my Irish side of my family have ever actually enslaved anybody. But there's those who, with careful handling might begin to, this is a learning process, and that's what I think needs to be taken into consideration. Right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Paul. Any questions? I've got a couple of minutes for questions. You sir at the back.
Thank you. Ibu Kanani by Restitution Capital. I got off a plane last night, so didn't really focus on the title of this particular panel, and I have to admit I wasn't familiar with the airs of slavery. I was expecting to see a panel of individuals who have also been victims as well as beneficiaries of slavery. But my quick comment is that I have to say that I am extremely touched by the tone and level of humility of the panel. I think it's deeply, deeply important work that you're doing in all of your experiences. Yes. I think in a world today where we're focused on transactions and we're focused on these interactions which are not meaningful, I've been very deeply touched by all of your accounts, and I'm very glad that you're all in the world of communicating and publicising what you do, but do continue. It's great in terms of what you do.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for your time. I'll be brief. I've engaged with the heirs of slavery at previous panel events and so forth. It's nice to see that you're focused on how you can help other families to overcome their reluctance to step forward, and your emphasis on education, because an important thing to consider is that as the wider community in this country for the African diaspora in Britain, as they become more aware and more comfortable with this conversation, it will be more incumbent on heirs to come forward. Now, I say that wearing two hats. One, I'm working with the Church of England on Project Spire and working in the archives, going through these original documents and helping them to bring to life their connection with the child enslavement of African people. I'm also wearing a United Nations hat in terms of being a fellow for people of African descent. So my question for you is, you don't have to necessarily answer, it's something more for you to consider. How are you going to ensure that you are able to also connect with African descendants in this country in the same way you've been able to do it abroad? Because obviously there are different dynamics in play. And back to the UN framework, the racial disparities that Black people in this country face are directly related to the issue that you're dealing with. So there will have to be some reckoning with the Black population in this country. So the question for you to take away and consider is what specifically you're doing to that. And that's also to join as well.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think we're probably going to have to... Do we have time for... Yeah?
One more.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm thinking, Tessa Henry Robinson, moderator of the Free Churches Group and president of CTE, which is Churches Together England, one of the presidents. I just want to, in terms of the legacies of all of this, we people who have, who are descendants of enslaved people, are living the legacies of the past. And I wonder if you're recognizing too that whether you have families that have owned plantations and so forth, that you too are living the legacies, and how is that being talked about in your forums?
Does anybody want to answer that? I'm happy to answer that. It's an interesting question. One of the first things that happened to me when I came onto panels, and in fact, I had an audience member who said to me, a black audience member said to me, "I'm really glad I'm not you, because actually the sort of psychic damage that your ancestors perpetrated is so deep that you don't realise that you're messed up too." And I had to go away and think about that. And I think this is a really difficult conversation to be had. I think it's a conversation that's had amongst some descendants of enslavers when they're really honest and they think about what actually their ancestors did, because it's incredibly damaging. And I'm not proud. In fact, I haven't really forgiven my ancestors for what they did. I don't know if any of you feel the same thing. Do you want to?
Yes. Thank you so much for the question. I just wanted to follow up on what John just said. When I found out about my family's history and I started to research, and I really encountered the brutality and the violence of what my ancestors had done, one of the things I found was that they owned a chapel. And this chapel was where people were kidnapped, were taken there, they were forcibly baptized before they were sent to Brazil. And on top of this chapel, there was this coat of arms, that was my family coat of arms. And to be able to place this coat of arms on this chapel, they had to ask for permission, because that's what you did at the time. And when they asked for permission, they said, in the official permission document that I found in the archives, they said that they wanted to place the coat of arms there on top of the chapel's door, so that their descendants will be proud of what they have done. They'll be proud of their work. And I think when I read that, and kind of to answer that question and follow up on what John said, for me, was really a wake-up call, and to acknowledge that, yes, my ancestors were in the wrong side of history. Yes, they committed a crime against humanity. And to tell my ancestors somehow, that I'm not proud, and I know that I don't want to be on the wrong side of history. So I think some of this work is also a way to challenge what my ancestors did, right? And to say, I now know, right? And I don't take it, and I don't believe in what you did, and I want to do something different. So I think it's also part of that. Yeah.
Thank you for the question. We're good. We're good? Okay. Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you for the panel.
So there was a lot of food for thought. I really do resonate with, what does that coat of arms mean? It meant that then. What is it going to mean going forward? So I think there's some exciting progress ahead. Thank you to our panelists for such an opening and thought-provoking discussion. We now move to our second panel, focusing on how advocates are shaping the policy, legal and moral framework for reparative justice. Joining us here today, we have Esther. Are we in the room? There we go. Right in front of me. Esther Stanford-Xosei is a reparationist, jury consultant, and community advocate. We also invite Reverend Donald Nathan, Pan-African preacher and faith-based consultant. Ronald McDonald. I've got it. Ronald. There we go. Ronald. And Claudia Webb, former Member of Parliament for Leicester East. Can I have a big round of applause inviting them on stage? This panel will be moderated by Dr. R. David Moore, Associate Supervisor at Westcott House, Cambridge University. Dr. Moore, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I know we're running about 15 minutes late, but it was really important to get those questions in. My name is Dr. David Muir. I'm very glad to see my good friend, Professor William Acker, from the Transatlantic Roundtable on Religion and Race, a real international Pan-African gathering of scholars, preachers, and activists. And I've heard some really, really important things there this morning. I want to thank Belle for her speech. I thought she was magnificent, and we have a lot to take away. And it's interesting that we're actually here in the Attlee room because, on the same day that the Windrush actually docked, 22nd of June 1948, 11 MPs, Labour MPs, wrote a letter to the Prime Minister, Attlee, complaining about these folks who had just landed. And at the end of this letter, this is what these Labour MPs said. They said that an influx of coloured people domiciled here is likely to impair the harmony, strength, and cohesion of our public and social life, and to cause discord and unhappiness among all concerned. And they were saying that to people like Sam King, who had just fought for king and country. And in the funny way, our friend Cornel West, the African-American academic, talked about the insurrection of subjugated knowledges. And although that may sound a bit like Foucault, what West is saying is that we've actually got to control the archives, the knowledge, the epistemologies of all the things that we're talking about. It's important for us to have young academics, young researchers who's doing this work and bringing all this thing to the fore. What I'm going to do very quickly is to ask our panelists to introduce themselves very quickly. And then I've got a series of questions for all three of them. So if we start with Claudia, please. Okay.
Well, thank you. I mean, I've had an introduction. My name is Claudia Webb. I'm the former UK Member of Parliament from 2019 to 2024. During my time in Parliament, indeed my maiden speech, I made sure that I was going to make my presence known as far as the importance of reparations, and made mention of the fact that my presence in the House reflected British history, in the sense that were it not for my ancestors who didn't give up, then I would not be present in the House during that time. And throughout my time in Parliament, the reality is reparations had to be addressed, because were it not for the British Parliament and the laws we make, so entering and being a member of Parliament means you are a lawmaker. And it was because of lawmakers before me why we had the transatlantic slave trade in the first place. And ours is one of internationalism. We cannot look just inward in terms of the British Empire, the UK. We also have to look internationally, and we have to recognise that that we cannot have reparations in other words, without reparations, we are never going to decolonise, because in actual fact, reparations is the final stage of decolonisation. And so if we understand that, then we understand also that when the UN says that its basic principles of reparations demand 5 essential things, they say that it demands remedy, it demands restitution, it demands compensation, it demands rehabilitation and satisfaction and guarantees of no repetition. Now, that all sounds fine, but the converse is that we have, in terms of an international institution, the UN, that sounds fine, but the converse is we have the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, whose colonial institutions actually masquerade as development partners. They continue their decades-long campaign of structural adjustment and austerity, whilst private creditors reap profits from Africa's development. The African, so therefore, they are reaping debt. So the African nations can never repay that debt. So it continues. And unless we address this fundamental reality, we are never going to move forward. Unless Britain is able and British lawmakers are able to address that with lawmakers across the globe, we're never going to get out of this situation and never going to get to the stage of decolonization.
Thank you. Esther, please.
Yeah, so I guess just in terms of an introduction to myself, reparations scholar, activist, campaigner, researcher, I am the executive director of something called the Maangamizi Educational Trust, which is the educational arm of the Stop the Maangamizi We Charge Genocide Ecocide campaign. The Stop the Maangamizi We Charge Genocide Ecocide campaign was co-founded by PARCO, the Pan-African Reparations Coalition in Europe, that I am co-vice chair of, and we also share the running of the Secretariat for the All-Party Parliamentary Group for African Reparations that Belle Ribeiro-Addy MP chairs, and that we lobbied her to establish in order to take forward our campaign demand to establish a administrative reparations proposal, which we refer to as the All-Party Parliamentary Commission of Inquiry for Truth and Reparatory Justice. So that's a basic introduction to myself.
Thank you. And Ron?
Thank you. My name is Ronald Nathan. I am an elder of the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. That's the church of Frederick Douglass,
Yes.
Sojourner Truth,
Yes.
Harriet Tubman. The discussion, and we saw some of it on screen, concerning 40 acres and a mule, came as an initiative by church leaders in British American colonialism. That discussion was held with 20 black church leaders who were asked the question, if the British defeat the Americans in the war, what would the slaves require? So reparations was a discussion that came out of an initiative speaking to black ministers. I say that to say this. Slavery, transatlantic slavery as we know it, could not exist and had the impact it could without the consent and baptism and sanctification of the Christian church in Europe. That goes without saying. The church therefore must be central to addressing the issues of reparations. And the discussion about His Highness King Charles, they say King Charles is waiting on Parliament and Parliament is waiting on the church. The church plays a part in this Parliament. It is represented at all levels. The issue around funds that have been allocated to address certain injustices, that is not called a reparations fund. That whole discussion is only the tip of the iceberg when it comes to interrogating the moral and theological basis for why we are here today.
Thank you, Ron. Before I ask the panelists some general questions, I don't know if some of you will recall 207 in Westminster Abbey, when our friend Richard Reddy and others organised the service in the presence of Her Majesty and lots of other important people. And a young man called Toyin Obetu from Ligali stood up. And you remember what he said? Not in my name. Mm-hmm. And as soon as he said that, we saw security officers not really attentive, but we did see a black minister almost going to defend Her Majesty, as if Her Majesty's bodyguards couldn't actually defend her. And many people would say that what that did, that was a symbolic gesture of something very, very profound about ownership of what takes place. Toyin was trying to say that unless and until we at least acknowledge the tragedy that took place and happened to our ancestors, we are all guilty. And he was prepared to stand up. And by the way, he could have got shot, right? But he did what he did as a brave person. I don't want to forget that, because at that time, Joel Edwards, many of you would know him of blessed memory, and myself as his director of public policy, had to write a press statement. And many people were upset with us because we didn't say that Toyin did something outrageous. Toyin did something very, very brave. And we need more people like him now, especially young people. Now, the general question, I want the three of you to actually think about this question as to charity versus politics, whether reparations should be framed as a justice issue or a charity issue. Let's start with you, Esther.
Reparations is not a charity issue. I mean, we as reparationists have been saying that for decades. Reparations is an issue of justice, pure and simple. Claudia mentioned the UN guidelines on the right to a remedy and reparation that recognises under international law reparations are the human and people's rights of impacted and affected communities. Obviously, the more and more people that begin taking up reparations and trying to address remedies, there are some charitable models that are seeping in, but we've always been very clear as reparationists, part of movements for reparations, that reparations is not about charity. And that's why it is important to recognize the lineages of struggle, of reparations activisms, because as the movement becomes more mainstream, then we also see a co-opting of the language and a redefining of the liberatory and emancipatory goals of all reparations movements that were always connected to Black liberation, Pan-African liberation. And we're seeing less and less of that in a time of what we refer to as grassroots activists, as movement capture, elite capture, state capture of reparations agendas, and also the NGOization of reparations resistance and rebellion that we have been waging.
Thank you. And how about you, Ron? Do you want to have a go at that question?
Up until June of last year, I was a pastor in Barbados, just a few miles away from Drax Plantation. The discussion in Barbados is not one that has, let me say, been one driven by the community. It has been driven by the university, the academics, and recently by the Church of England's interaction with the church in Barbados, not with the Reparations Commission. And so we have to ask, what is the role of the church in presenting the fact that reparations is about recognizing the image and likeness of God in every human being and recognizing the need for repair for what has been done to the image and likeness of God.
Thank you. And
well, I mean, the issue of charity has long gone as a concept. Nobody speaks about this as charity anymore. We are where we are now, and any African worth his salt will understand the connectedness that Africa developed Europe at the same rate that Europe underdeveloped Africa. That is the truth of the matter. The reality is that Africa owes 2.1 trillion in debt, whilst rich countries owe Africa 36 trillion to 107 trillion in justice, climate justice. That is the reality. So we can't talk about charity or aid. We talk about we are due what is owed to us, and that is the context of which we must understand the whole situation. The Frantz Fanon, if you've read the works of Frantz Fanon, he declared that Europe is literally the creation of the third world, bloated by gold and raw materials from Africa. Debt, as Thomas Sankara said, and some might argue that's why he was killed. Debt, as Thomas Sankara said, is neocolonialism, in which colonizers have transformed themselves into technical assistants. We should rather say technical assassins, because that's what we are talking about. When African governments spend more on foreign debt, servicing healthcare, more on foreign debt than actually servicing healthcare, actually servicing what the people need. Then whilst corporations extract 100 billion yearly, 100 billion yearly through illicit financial flows, we are witnessing the continuation of indeed what Sankara identified as skillfully managed reconquest of Africa. Ours is an international struggle. We have to understand where our picture is. So we cannot let them talk about aid or charity. We have to take what is owed to us.
Thank you, Claudia. Now, I've got a question for each of you, and I want to start with Esther. Esther, because of your kind of background, I want to ask you, what legal frameworks you think exist or need to be developed to strengthen the case for reparations internationally?
Well, we've got good enough legal frameworks. The question is really implementation. But ultimately, law, as Karl Marx said, is about the rule of the will of the ruling classes, enacted into legislation. It's a question of power. I have a legal background as a jurisconsult, and we believe that it's movements that must shape and redefine what legal frameworks we utilize. And that is why we are advocating for a participatory reparations process. Most reparations settlements are done in three ways. Revolution, which I'm not sure is going to happen in the UK anytime soon. Legal action, or commissions of inquiry, truth commissions. So in a so-called Western liberal parliamentary democracy, that's why we are opting for the commission of inquiry. It's a kind of quasi-truth commission of inquiry to determine reparations proposals that have been afforded by communities. So the participation rights, I would say, is what needs to be strengthened, because even though we have the UN guidelines on the right to a remedy and reparations, it is what's considered to be soft law. So it is agreed by consensus by members of the United Nations, but implementation is where we fall short. So for instance, the UK government is not recognising the UN framework. And unless we compel them to do so, they won't do so. We also have something called the Belfast Guidelines, which looks at the rights of affected communities and so-called survivors of, violations of, massive human rights injustices, such as what some of us refer to as the Maangamizi, which is a Kiswahili term that speaks to the continuation of African chattel enslavement, colonialism and neocolonialism, but also the genocide, the war crimes, the ethnocide, and all of the dispossessions and attempts to destroy us as a human reality. And what we are arguing for is a recognition of the rights of affected communities to shape reparations processes in our interest. That is what many states, including African Union states and CARICOM states, are themselves not honouring or recognising. So what you have are state actors who have shaped reparations processes from the top, not from the ground up. And reparations is a principle that comes from the ground up. not from the top, not saying we can't work together, but states themselves must show that they are honouring international law. Why does this matter? There's a case going through the Namibian Parliament right now, Baroness Sandy and others, whereby leaders of the Over-Herero and Nama traditional authorities are suing the government of Namibia for being excluded in the negotiations between Namibia and Germany around genocide redress for the Over-Herero and Nama redress. Why are they suing Namibia? Because Namibia is saying, we are negotiating reparations settlements for the state. The Over-Herero and Nama people who experienced and survived the genocide, the first genocide of the so-called 20th century, are saying, no, we have a right to a seat at the table. There should be trilateral negotiations. And because the government of Namibia is not recognizing this, they went and got 7 UN special rapporteurs who have affirmed the participation rights of indigenous communities and all affected communities. And we are looking at this as a precedent in the Caribbean around CARICOM's failure to recognise our participation rights. And some of us are looking at it in the UK as well. So those are the frameworks that need to be strengthened, because otherwise what we get are people at the top, some well-intentioned, who are defining and reshaping what reparations look like. And the communities themselves are being totally marginalized and subjugated. And this is something that cannot be, because we are survivors. We are the ones who are living this legacy. And it is not right or just that those who are seeking to obtain material compensation from European nations and other powers are denying the survivors in their jurisdictions the right to have a say.
That's powerful. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Claudia, if you can be brief, but from your experience in Parliament, what are the greatest political challenges to advancing reparations in the UK, and how can they be overcome?
Oh, and the simple reality is that that our political leaders, the elite, the political elite, will not recognise reparations. And it's got nothing to do with the church. They simply will not recognise reparations. And the reality is we have to change the political makeup of our establishment. That is the only way we're going to get the change that we need, because they will not. I mean, if one was to recognise reparations, one would ensure that you introduce laws that would ensure companies, the corporates, that at least have their headquarters here, or indeed the billionaire corporates that trade significantly with the UK, one would ensure that they had at least a human rights agenda before we even do business with them. Africa continues to be underdeveloped today. We are in the stage of neo-colonialism. That is the most dangerous stage of imperialism. The underdevelopment of Africa that continues today continues in the form of the monopolization of our natural resources, for example. It continues in the form of the exploitation of black labour. It continues in the form of the refusal to hand back the African heritage artifacts and arts, and the enormous destruction and appropriation of knowledge through financial mechanisms. So we, when you think about the African Union, we had mention of the African Union already. This remains financially dependent on the very countries from whom reparative justice must be demanded, including the UK. Donors led by the UK, the United States, and the European Union fund over 70% of the African Union's operational budget. This contradiction embodies, of course, what people like Nkrumah warned of, which was, he said, the extent of neocolonial control is strong. And that is what we have to remember, because as Africa faces 11.6% in terms of its borrowing costs, Germany's borrowing cost is 1.5%. The United States borrowing cost is 3.5%. Now, these are the things that need to change. And Britain is doing nothing to bring about the kind of reparative justice that is needed, no matter how many black faces in high places. No matter. And so we have to, what is needed is a revolution, of course, because we have to end the capitalist destruction that is really keeping not only black communities here in a state of continued injustice, but it's also Africa, one of the richest countries in the world, continue to be raped and its minerals extracted and exploited and its people exploited. That is the reality of what we are dealing with, and that is why we don't need reform, we need total revolution.
Thank you. Before we get a few questions from the audience, can I just ask Ron, I know you said something about the church. What do you think can be done in terms of reparations in advancing this conversation in Christian congregations?
I believe that we need change at a number of areas. Our theological institutions are not having this discussion. And if they are not having this discussion, the leaders, church leaders are not preaching, teaching, or by example, doing anything that fosters even the knowledge about reparations. It is seldom mentioned in our sermons, our Sunday school literature, our youth literature. So that's one area. It needs to move into those particular arenas. But beyond that, the connection of the church here to the Caribbean, to Africa, to South America, we have to use those ecumenical bodies to also mobilize people in Europe as well as Africa, the Caribbean, and so forth, to have this discussion, to engage with other partners in moving this revolution forward.
Right, thank you. We've got time for just a couple of questions. Yes, please. Two. Yeah, two. One and one. One. Okay, let's go.
Thank you so much. That was very, very useful. I turned 30 very soon, and I'm first generation from Zimbabwe who's free from colonization. I loved what you talked about around neocolonialism because I don't hear it in the conversation enough. And my question was really around this of how do we begin to look after the 60% of Africans who are under the age of 35 who are still having to go through slavery, in a form of slavery, where right now we've got AI, that is meaning that the richer continue to get richer and then the poorer are still getting poorer. I run an organization at the moment called Letters to Africa, trying to train these young people. How do we look after them? They don't have electricity, they don't have water, and their resources continue to be rummaged. So I'm just interested.
Right, Claudia, can you take that very, very quickly, please? Then we got.
Well, I mean, what I've spoken about is the institutional racism of the global finance system, and unless we begin to understand that, we are not going to make the change that is necessary. So if we can, get our education. They don't teach the truthful education about Africa, about Asia, or the Caribbean here in the UK. They claim they've done it, but they haven't done it. And the reality is we've got to teach that truthful education in terms of moving forward for the next generation. But we've also got to understand the institutional racism of global finance, because that is what is keeping Africa down in terms of what is going on. Our corporations are extracting and becoming billionaires and creating billions out of the downfall of Africa and its people, and it's lasting generations upon generations upon generations, and will continue to do so unless we stop it.
Thank you. Dr. William from London University, please.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you to the panelists, and certainly want to acknowledge all the amazing work that Esther and the panelists have been doing. So my question is that Esther, but the others could probably answer is, I suppose, how do you see the kind of relation between some of the kind of piecemeal things that are happening, universities, newspapers, the church, saying that they're doing reparations, and then the more systematic things that we want to see in relation to profound change? Do you think those piecemeal efforts are helpful, or are they damaging to the overall?
Can we get a quick word from all the panelists, please, very, very quickly? Esther, let's start with you.
In some instances, they can be helpful, but in many cases, they are damaging. Why am I saying that? Because they are redefining the scope of what reparations have always meant for those who've been championing it. When I started out as a reparationist, many people in this room would not have been pro-reparations or supporting it. People that looked like me, I'm telling you. We were considered extremists, what today are called black identity extremists, as pro-reparationists. It was a fringe issue. So unless communities are helping to shape that process, and one institution in the UK that I will commend is doing that. The University of Edinburgh Research and Engagement Working Group, they've just done a big review, like many of these universities, a reparatory justice review called Decolonized Transformations. I'm involved with that, and one of the things that they instituted were something called the 12 Principles of Participation, which were based on the principles of participation from INASAR, the International Network of Scholars and Activists for African Reparations. In this, we have principles around how we work with affected communities, recognizing mutual knowledge sharing, recognizing that there's an ethics to dealing with reparations for people of African heritage and ancestry. You cannot just go and take up this issue without regard to who is impacted. It just wouldn't happen. It has never happened with any other people's reparation struggle. But with ours, anybody can be an expert. This is unethical. So it's whose knowledge is. And reparations for African people of all descriptions, whether we're born in the Caribbean, on the continent, in the diaspora, must center African ways of knowing and being and epistemologies. They must. Because that otherwise it's not reparatory. We're using knowledge frameworks that will never ever heal, restore, and repair us.
I didn't really care much for these issues many years ago. Reason being is that I've spent 30 years in the City of London working in investment banks, and I was the co-head of emerging markets at the London Stock Exchange Group. I ran group sustainability and finance and investment strategy. And really, to be honest with you, although I'm a very proud British Nigerian, I didn't really think about these issues in the depth with which they need. It was really, for me, an epoch setting up the business that I set up 5 years ago called Restitution Capital, where I was noticing when I was doing my work and my job every day, I was wondering why, to Claudia's point, why is it that Nigeria's borrowing costs are 11% and Germany's are 3%? Why is it that every time I try to introduce an investor into the Congo that they complain about the project risk or the credit risk? Why is it that they complain about the FX risk? Why are all these risks there? So I said, okay, let's go about this formalized way of mitigating risk. So for the credit risk, we brought in guarantors. For the FX risk, we brought in structured financial products. But even after all of that, we were told, well, there's economic risk and there's political risk. And this really got me saying, well, what do we do in order to reduce those risks as well? So you can buy some very expensive political risk insurance from any of the insurance companies and really get you anywhere. It doesn't solve the problem. And then the economic risk is a result of some of the issues and challenges that in all of the emerging countries that we deal in. it then got me reading a really interesting piece of academic research by a gentleman called Nathan Nunn, who is a Canadian professor in economics. And he opened my eyes to the fact that the legacy of slavery and colonialism is the fact that it created ethnic tensions within all of the communities that it touched. It's created underdeveloped political systems which exacerbate the endemic corruption that now exists in those countries. And this creates instability, and it creates a poor economic scenario and status in all of those countries. And that is the key crux to all of this. This is why the borrowing costs are so high, because the risks are so high. And they are risks that are born out of challenges that were brought before us because of all of what the panelists have mentioned earlier. So before it was the South Sea Company, the East India Company, and the Church of England as well, who exacerbated all of these things. But today, the new individuals or the new corporations are the multinational companies in particular. They are the advisor enablers. So the law firm that creates the egregious and unconscionable economic terms in a contract, the accounting firm that puts together the tax structure that creates the layering that hides the movement of cross-border flows. It's all of these put together that create these tremendous issues that all emerging market companies or countries suffer from. And ultimately, this continues to fuel corruption. It supports the payment of bribes and perpetuates these supernormal profits that are made by these companies. And I'll give you an example of that. At Restitution Capital, we've started working now with the IMF. Yes, I know, sort of double-edged sword, right? But we've come up with we'll launch it at the end of this year. It's a very interesting thing called the corruption premium. And it stands for two things. It's the price that a multinational company is prepared to pay to facilitate business in a country, usually an emerging market. So how much money do they put to one side to pay for bribes, in effect? The second part of that index is to what extent is the factor of supernormal profit expected for working in that country. So if you go to DRC, you need a supernormal profit of X, and that delta is considerably different to the one that you would have in another country, and it's facilitated by the bribes. So this is really, really where we're focusing on. How do we highlight this behaviour by these series of bad actors? I've had this slide up for a few minutes just so that you can digest it a little bit. And this is really the top 10 countries in Africa. It's not just Africa where we have these issues, but where we see illicit financial flows. Now, illicit financial flows, as you know, is everything that is all sorts of cross-border flows which are made that are against the law, either international or national laws. Ultimately, tax evasion, transfer pricing, matters of this nature, which continue to create and remove monies from countries, effectively becoming stolen patrimony that belongs to these countries. Take a look at those numbers. They look really interesting, or not, but let me give you a couple of facts behind them there. Sudan, $78 billion lost in the last 20 years. The GDP of Sudan is $50 billion per year. So you can see what's been taken and what's there. In DRC, in 2024, the healthcare budget was $2.5 billion. That there, $338 billion in terms of illicit financial flows. And then the most interesting one of all, as you can see, South Africa, nearly $1 trillion worth of money removed illegally by these corporates. These are just corporate IFFs, by the way, tax evasion, transfer pricing, etc., has come from South Africa. You could raise, with $903 billion, the price of affordable housing subsidy in South Africa by 10 times for the next 10 years, based on that money that has been taken. Okay? So, all right. So what are we doing about it? We all know what the problem is. Okay? So we're here to problem solve. How long do I have? 1 minute. Oh, gosh. So we've tried to create a system which works directly with sovereign governments to use the tools that have been used against these countries for many, many years, financial and legal tools, to become the world's first litigation fund that acts for sovereign governments. So we raise private capital in order to create civil lawsuits against the multinational companies. We've been extraordinarily successful so far. We have a pipeline of just under $3 billion worth of capital that's going to be returned to African countries. We have a case in the UK court right now against certain bad actors in Namibia, which is worth over $1 billion, which would go back to the people in Namibia. And everything that we do as a business is aligned with the World Bank's Stolen Asset Recovery Program to ensure that there is a proper flow of money, which is oversight being given by civil society to ensure that money that comes back is not re-corrupted. So we work also very closely with government. So we've been fortunate enough to receive grant funding from the UK government through the Rule of Law UK, the Swedish government through their Swedish International Development Agency, CEDA, and also from some foundations like the George Soros Foundation and the Oak Foundation. But I want to commend everybody in this room because we're all doing different things in different ways, but we're all trying to see what the solutions are now as opposed to thinking about what the problems are. But I'll stop there. Thank you.
Next, we hear from Priya Luka, economic justice advocate. She recently has been working at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights at the United Nations, and I would like to have a big round of applause for her. Priya, the floor is yours.
Thank you to David and colleagues for organising today's discussion. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my experiences of working in economics, working in economic justice spaces, and what brought me to really understanding and thinking about the importance of reparations, which is so crucial for how we see some of those debates and issues that we're working on a structural issue of like why the economy isn't fair, why it's so unfair for so many communities, for so many groups, for so many countries around the world. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we've seen reparations happen, some examples of how they're being pursued, and what this means for how we deal with ongoing economic injustices of the world. So starting up with how we've seen them happen, I think wherever there's been a case of historic dispossession and the genocide of people and their lands, the case for reparations is valid. But how they're achieved matters for whether justice was realised. So our debates really start in a way with an understanding of the form of reparations in different settings. So where we've seen reparations happened, it's been in very traditional ways. There have been compensation for material and tangible harms, the loss of life, of course, human rights violations. And there's a lot of damage where, there's a sense of the moral and physical suffering, as well as harms to traditional relationships or ways of life. So following the First World War in 1952, Germany agreed to pay Jewish people for genocide. Around the same time, we saw reparations that were paid to several countries in Southeast Asia by Japan for war-related impacts. More recently, in 2009, the Mau Mau freedom fighters participated in a struggle for independence against British colonial rule, and they were compensated in British court. So these examples give a kind of common understanding of reparations as achieved through financial transfers. But actually, there's also been lots of examples of compensation in lots of different ways defined by communities, and compensation for human rights violations as well. And for example, in Suriname in South America, we saw compensation for a loss of ancestral land, for traditional territories where rights were taken away by logging licenses, which were granted for timber extraction in 2000. In Bhopal in India in 1984, when there was a chemical spillage killing thousands of people, here state justice systems were used for awarding material damages, again, in a very contained way as a remedy for private sector failings for its human rights obligations. But if you look at what the community dialogue and the critique of examples that I've just referenced in here, is. It really is around the lack of appraisal of the harm that's resulted and the missing community perspectives that are not suitably gathered or consulted on. So as Esther said, the participation rights is really fundamentally missing in a lot of the ways that we have seen reparations take place in just a few examples that I've cited there. So the learning is that how far processes have happened, how far they've delivered on justice still gives a lot of room for progress. So turning to see how we've seen reparations being pursued, when we look at examples in current movements, and I'm only going to reference a few because of the time, but there are so many movements, and I think so many have been referenced today as well. We see different journeys of reparations beyond just the material. In the case for reparations for transatlantic slavery, the magnitude of people involved and impacted and the racialized structures that have remained are the key arguments for the case. And as a result, there's lots of scholars who are progressing claims for a redistribution of America's wealth. There are also lots and lots of other groups who are coalescing around a forward-looking claim for justice based on an end to racism that's hardwired into structures as a legacy of the American slave codes that led to segregation in education, in work, in other settings. So what we see in like the kind of more kind of different movements that are beyond financial restitution is that there's ideas around thinking as matters beyond financial redress and centering actually the need for community sovereignty and restoration. And there's also many movements who are progressing claims for colonialism. And here I'm really stressing this is not about the government process. This is also about what the movement identity around what different claims are. So in the 1880s, we saw Britain, France, Germany, Spain, Portugal, Italy, the Netherlands expand their territorial domination. And by 1921, 84% of the world was colonized through the acquisition of 168 territories. But by 1960, over half of those areas were independent. So colonialism had encompassed during that time very harsh, very unfair, very exploitative economic policies and capitalist structures, and the imposition of colonizer social structures, the imposition of cultural relations of colonized and colonizer. And then at the end of that formal colonization in 1950s, we saw newer forms of economic, military, and political domination establishing that kind of permanent European settlement. So why does reparations then matter for kind of, the areas that I work in, economic justice? A lot of what's already been discussed, Claudia gave lots of examples, were around the structures of current trade, debt, and tax rules. And a lot of the analysis from scholars across the world, but particularly universities outside in the North, is that colonialism is continuous. So the current policies that we see across the world are ones that continue to wield the strength of elite power holders and organizations. So that modern feature of colonialism is this model of vast profitability for a minority and growing inequality for the majority. And we see this in unfair trade terms. We see this in the existence of tax havens that allow multinationals to offshore their profits and essentially not pay taxes towards the provision of public services. So there is a much broader vision of justice in the claims for repair, and the legacy of colonialism impacts in so many ways. Right now we're seeing like the key issue around adaptation and mitigation that's available to global South communities for the social and environmental impacts of climate change. So there are many movements for reparations for climate change across the world, but they advocate more broadly around wealth and asset redistribution and the dismantling of elite power, which built up through colonialism and transatlantic slavery. For example, the Asian People's Movement for Debt and Development argue that there is this huge unpayable debt of the North to the South caused by centuries of extractivism that damaged not only the ecosystem, but the planet as a whole. And they term this in their campaign as ecological debt, which is the accumulated debt by northern industrial countries owed to the South from resource plundering and environmental destruction. Another aspect of economic justice is the issue of debt. I know it's been spoken about, but we have seen from the 1970s onwards an investment boom in former colonized countries, an investment boom that was highly exploitative, leading to a debt bubble because the loans from the former colonizer countries had interest rates that increased over time. That was very challenging in terms of the repayments. And this was the start of the structural debt crisis for these countries, which has just existed for decades now. That debt has accumulated. Many countries now have to cut their public budgets as part of the strict conditionalities of the loans that they're struggling with. And we know that African countries spend, for example, more on interest payments today than any of their health spending, any of their education spending. So therefore, for campaigners and movements across the world, they position debt as an issue of reparations because of the lack of public funds that are available for critical human life social spending, just to give the basic human rights foundation and framework. So here, reparations, and the idea is of, a return of decades of wealth to enable the spending for social services. And we see in movements now really a linking of historical wealth capture to address the glaring current day inequalities. So to summarize, I think that as many points have been said already, there are many movements that are articulating the call for justice through demanding systems change, including, most importantly, of, as Claudia said, the racist global financial architecture that governs economies and rules around environmental extraction. And in the arguments for climate and ecological debt reparations, there is a desire to move to a kind of new economic paradigm that restores rather than depletes the environment and the ecosystem. So here we have, as very similarly expressed, I think, in the Pan-African movement, we have narratives of holistic, non-material repair to enable visions of justice to be realized. So it's not just an argument for financial restitution or land redistribution or just energy. It is about tackling a financial system that wields debt as a policy instrument for countries where basic human rights aren't met yet. And in closing, I'd just say that the acknowledgement or the liability of the unjust enrichment of perpetrator countries who colonize the world is missing in how we think about economic issues, particularly economic governance. And that's why reparations is so important for it. That's why I work in global justice spaces, in feminist economic spaces, where we are really trying to push our understanding, our own knowledge, our own education of reparations to look at the harm that's been caused by institutions in the states. And it's not just about the sums that would be paid, if anything, much broader than that. There are real education is in the broader concepts of reparations that are really richly intertwined with the perspective to re-envision the structures that govern the world and demand that radical and justice-driven change. So, thank you.
We all know that the global north massively affects the global south, right? Disproportionately. There are so many cases, and I think one thing that we do have with environment here is that we have the facilities now to measure these things. A recent study done, I remember I was reading about Pakistan, that they emit 2% of global emissions, only 2%, right? That's the same as aviation in its entirety. But yet, a couple of years ago, due to climate change, 50% of their population had to mobilize from their country, which is 33 million people. So a country that only pollutes, say, 2% is having half of their country having to move further down in the country from the flooding. So it's really interesting. Thank you for these insights. It's very inspiring. So next, we are going to go to Joseph Harker, co-founder of the Legacies of Enslavement Project. Also to mention, he is the senior editor of diversity and development at The Guardian. Come to the stage, please. Hey.
I am the co-founder of the Legacies of Enslavement Project, not the co-lead, which it says in the leaflets that are given out today. But thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks very much for putting this on today. It's really good to be involved. As I said, I'm at The Guardian. I've been at The Guardian for over 30 years, and it's changed quite a bit in that time. But maybe I just want to, I think one of the questions that was asked earlier is one that I should be particularly addressing directly. And you asked, are piecemeal efforts by different institutions, are they helpful or are they damaging? And I think the answer is it depends. But in terms of what we're doing at The Guardian, I think I'll tell you what we're doing and why we're doing it, and let you be the judge of that. For us, the story starts as it did for Paul when he was talking about the day that the Edward Colston statue was torn down. And obviously that moved the Black Lives Matter discussion from racism of the present to racism of the past, and that relationship between the present and the past, and why we continue to honour brutal enslavers. At The Guardian, it meant that questions started being asked about the Guardian's own foundation. We were founded in 1821 in the city of Manchester, and anyone who knows the history of Manchester knows that it grew out of the cotton trade. And cotton, many of the people in the city and this side of the Atlantic don't necessarily appreciate, but cotton is all about slavery. Cotton was all produced from enslaved people. So the question became then, was The Guardian founded off the profits of slavery? Did it have a slavery connection? So we commissioned an outside researcher, an independent researcher, first from the University of Nottingham and then from the Wilberforce Institute at Hull University. And she looked into it and discovered that not only the Guardian founder, John Edward Taylor, who was a cotton merchant, but also all 9 of his 11 funders, who we could trace, had made their money through cotton, which basically meant that the Guardian absolutely had a very strong connection with slavery. The question then became, what do we do about it? It told us the fact that all the founders and funders who we could trace had a connection, told us that this wasn't just a story about The Guardian, but it was a story about Manchester. It also connected us then to the Sea Islands off the coast of Georgia and South Carolina, where the cotton was grown, which the Guardian founder had bought. It also connected us to Jamaica, where one of the original funders owned a plantation in the parish of Hanover. So what did we then had to? So it was clear we had a very strong connection to slavery, and at that point they asked me to lead this project, to co-lead this project, to look into what we could do in response to that. The first thing, of course, was to agree to do an apology. That was the kind of most basic thing, an apology for the Guardian's founder's role in this crime against humanity. But we also wanted to do something which met the moment. An apology was never going to be enough. So the Scott Trust, which owns The Guardian, asked me to produce a Legacies of Enslavement programme, and it was my job to work out what to do. And we did that in consultation with people of colour who are on staff, with outside reparations experts and voices. Also within our own, the board of the Scott Trust, which owns The Guardian, we had one of the members is David Olusoga, which was brilliant to have as him giving us guidance on all of this. So we did wide consultation, and so we came up with a multi-pronged approach. One was, the most basic was our journalism, and in a way the easiest thing to do was to commit to diversifying our journalism and creating new roles in our journalism as well. So we've created new roles in the South America. We've got a South America correspondent who's based in Brazil, and Brazil is a country which has, as already been said, has a massive population descended from slavery, over 100 million people. And you think about how many times do we ever hear about the African descended population of Brazil? Barely never, even though Brazil has the second highest black population in the world behind Nigeria. So we've now got a correspondent covering that population there. We've got a correspondent, a Caribbean correspondent who's based in Jamaica. And again, we are now the only British media organisation to have a Caribbean correspondent. I mean, that's shocking in its own right that we would be that this is the first and this is the only one. But we now have Natricia Duncan, who's based in Jamaica. And we also have other roles covering race and equity across the United States, 2 roles in the UK, and 2 roles, one in East and one in West Africa. So telling these stories, holding people to account, covering reparations as an issue, and giving it publicity, and the day-to-day struggles of groups and descendant communities in Brazil, the Caribbean, and the southern United States. So that's a really important thing that we can do, and something that we can do beyond the kind of monetary amount, but being able to publicize these communities, being able to publicize their campaigns is something which might ultimately actually have more impact than the hands-on work that we're doing. We also want to go beyond The Guardian, and we are well aware that we have a global readership. Millions of people look at The Guardian every day, but obviously it's a very small part of the population. So what can we do to connect with people beyond The Guardian? So we're trying to tell this story by putting on events, and we're also working with the Science and Industry Museum in Manchester, which is the biggest museum in Manchester, the most popular museum. It already has a large display on the cotton industry, and we're going to be working with them on an exhibition which will launch in 2027, in just under 2 years' time, to tell the story of the enslaved people, where the cotton came from, that created the wealth that created the city of Manchester. We're also doing direct work with descendants in those on the other side of the Atlantic, in the Sea Islands. There's a particular population, the Gullah Geechee people, who are descendant from enslaved people and who went to that area through via Barbados. And they've kept, because they're on islands off the coast of Georgia, South Carolina, they've kept their history and kept their culture, but at the same time, that history and culture is now under threat from property developers. And so we are doing we have journalists there who are telling this story, but we also have a program manager who's permanently based there, who's now working with those communities on and part of our consultation process in working out what those communities would like us to do, how we can help, and coming up with a program of work. We've got a person now who's just started working in Jamaica, working around the area of Hanover Parish, where the Guardian Funders plantation was, and he's going to again be doing more consultation work. We've already done some of this by having visits to Jamaica and the Sea Islands and finding out that some of the themes that were already coming through are education, history, education in terms of schools resources, but also education in terms of telling this history and making people aware of it. But also in the southern United States, there's a particular battle for land and land ownership, which, as I said, against the property developers, and we're seeing what we can do to bolster their campaign and their efforts to hold on to their land and their history. So this is a developing program. It's a 10-year program. From the start, I wanted it to be significant, meaningful, and long-lasting. Giving it a 10-year span means that we have time to do the research, to do the consultation, to find out the right things to do, the things that communities are wanting us to do, and to have the time to sort of embed that program in and embed the changes so that it will have, hopefully, a long-lasting impact. So we're not in any rush to spend the money on the wrong kind of things, but we're just wanting to get it right before we start investing and to start working with descendants communities. So we've hired a program director, Ebony Riddell-Bamber, who has a history in advocacy, human rights, and social justice, and she's been leading our work in this. So, as I say, consultation is the most important thing. We are the wrong side of the Atlantic, where this global, basically a white institution. There's no way that we could impose our thoughts on local descendant communities. We need to know what they want. And also part of our work beyond that is telling people why this story matters. It was mentioned earlier about the 2007 bicentenary celebrations of the end of the slave trade and the glorification of William Wilberforce. So I think that's another really important point in this, in that for so many of us, even if we accept that slavery was a bad thing that Britain did and Britain had gained from it, it's this sense that it was 200 years ago, it's ancient history, it's time to move on. Why keep dragging up the past? And it's important. It's just really important that in the stories we tell, in the coverage we do, we make clear why this story still matters. And obviously the racism and the stereotypes and the bigotry and the white supremacy that and those attitudes which were embedded over the centuries before 1807 really matter, and they're still very much with us. But just in doing this project, I was educated myself, because I'd always seen that 1807 was a date, and obviously 1833 is the date that slavery itself was abolished. But then, knowing the cotton merchants and the businessmen of Manchester were making money through slavery right until the end of the Civil War in the United States, and up to 1888 in their buying and selling cotton and produce from enslaved people in Brazil, it brings it much closer. There's a big difference between 1807 and 1888. And not only that, but the people who were born into slavery lived well into the 20th century. One of the things that really struck me was in a slavery museum in Charleston, and there's a recording in there that was taken, and it was recorded in the 1930s, of someone talking about their childhood in slavery when they were about 7 years old when slavery was abolished in the United States, when the Civil War ended. But that person was there alive in the 1930s. My mother was born in the 1930s. She's still alive. And so you realize that this story, this history which we're told is like so ancient, so old, was basically just 2 lifetimes ago. It's still very present. And then when you add to that the fact that, as we know, the enslavers got compensation, the people who were enslaved got absolutely nothing, no land, no property, no wealth. And even the visits we've had to Charleston, for example, to the southern United States, you stay in a hotel. The hotel will be a white-run hotel. You go to a restaurant, the restaurants are all white, the shops are all white where you spend your money. It's almost like every penny you spend widens that inequality between the descendants of enslavers and the descendants of the enslaved. And so that's why it's such an important issue that we need to address today, and it still matters. And so hopefully our journalism will do that, will be educational in informing people why these stories matter. We're working with descendant communities, so maybe come back in another 8 years' time and we can answer that question about whether it's health or damaging. But I would like to hopefully we're on the right path to doing something that's worthwhile. Thank you.
Next, I'm going to welcome to the stage Timmy Akua, the Chief Executive Officer of Black Equity Organisation. A big round of applause for you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. It's a privilege to be part of this conference. I work for the Black Equity Organisation. We were launched in 2022 after the murder of George Floyd and also the Windrush scandal. We want to be, and we are, the UK's first national independent civil rights organisation, founded by and for Black communities. And we turn evidence into action through strategic litigation. So we had a case on Windrush where we started with a petition, then it went to court. There was a successful judgment on the back of that, and then we've started doing some programs on the back of that work, as well as working with other organizations in this space. We also made sure that we've got credible research to underpin all the work that we do, policy advocacy as well. There's lots of policy work that needs to be done, and strategic convening, so bringing different groups together. Our mission is clear and remains unequivocal: dismantling systemic racism and building structures that last so that Black people in Britain can thrive more. In 2024, we launched a Black Britain mandate as part of our democratic programs. So we went out about 20 events across the UK to speak to Black communities about, we want you to vote more and so on. There was a lot of apathy in the rooms that we were in terms of why does our vote really matter and so on. But the thing that we did at the time to provide a bit more of an underpinning foundation is the creation of a Black Britain's mandate. And in that, we did a lot of engagement and lots of policies. We came up with about 60, and we had to reduce them down from 60 to 30. And we've been using those policies to hold institutions to account, again, with strategic litigations and so on. We did a survey at the point, and we spoke to more than about 1,000 Black people in the UK. And the two things that came out from them is that we want to see more progress when it comes to reparations, and that there needs to be more education. And I remember growing up, I grew up here, and then my parents took me back to Nigeria as a young woman. But colonialism was normalized. It was only when I came back to the UK and I got involved more and more that I realized what colonialism and reparations was about. And Claudia Webb, you talked about this in a lot of detail, and I'm a woman that really reflects on patterns. That slavery was built on an architecture of exploitation. Colonialism has deepened it. And today what we're seeing is more strategic forms of control. We've talked about debt leverage on equal contracts and security and technology arrangements. I go back to Nigeria very often, and there are a significant number of protests that happen because there are some parts of Nigeria where, because some global countries are present there, that people, Nigerian people, can't go to. I mean, just, I can't understand that, but that's the kind of thing that we are seeing at the moment. So the flags of empire may no longer fly, but the logic of empire remains. And reparations for me is about that forward looking. I think it's been mentioned at various points in the conversations here. It's not just about the historical harm that was caused. It's also ensuring that we are just more strategic in ensuring that it's not, we don't have an evolved version of it, which we can see. So as a call for action, we do know that reparations must be a shared goal and a global responsibility. It's about collective commitment to repair the harm caused by centuries of exploitation. I think acknowledging the past and educating for the future is important. Formal recognition by all former colonial powers, including the UK, of the profound and lasting damage caused by their historical actions. It's not just about reforming here in the UK, but it's also about partnering fairly in Africa and in the Caribbean. One of the other things that I also was doing was just actually looking at the diaspora, because that's what I am, as well. And the amounts of money from people in the UK and globally that go back to Africa and the Caribbean is so huge. I was looking at the data points. It's really difficult to measure it, but apparently migrants sent 9.3 billion to home countries. Nigeria in 2021 received 2.7 billion from global parts of the UK, of the country into Nigeria. And so given that level of funds, that's a fantastic opportunity. We need to leverage that in terms of reparative justice. Also for us as an organization, a lot of the work that we do is about tackling structural inequalities that disproportionately affect Black communities. So we've got this program that we run called the F100 Growth Fund. We support Black entrepreneurs. We give them 15K, which is not billions, but it's something, and it does provide them with significant support. Because when it comes to Black founders, they receive 0.24% when it comes to venture funds. And when you get a venture fund, it is tough in terms of the demands for you to return that. We also did a report last year about young Black children in the UK. So we call it the state of Black education. And as a mum of a young Black boy, I remember before I came to BEO, the number of times I had to go to school with him because he was suspended or various things were happening. And one of the things that we're doing now is to provide parents in the UK with additional support in terms of what you need to do. So that not wait to see when exclusion comes, but actually begin to see the root and how to deal with it. I also think that governments and institutions in Africa and the Caribbean need to do more, I think, in terms of reinforcing and strengthening negotiating with a reparative lens by demanding open contracting, fair value, and joint control of strategic assets. There are going to be some times where people are going to say, thank you, but no. I was speaking to this very rich Black entrepreneur the other day who's doing some work in Africa, and he reached out to various countries to provide him with some loans. He then did find somebody, a country, to support him. The interest rates were just so high. They were also requesting that all of the products to create this work should be bought from them, and the interest rates on that was equally high, and that in terms of delivering that work, he couldn't use anybody in terms of, from the home countries. It had to be people that were going to be brought over to deliver that work. And in the end, he said he didn't want to do that. So I think there needs to be sometimes a lot more saying, yes, we need the finance, but actually, if you look at the long-term picture of what it and the demands that it places on us, that we might have to say no. So the work that BEO is doing is we want to continue to build the path towards strong partnerships with peer organisations and like-minded individuals to make the case for reparations. It is now part of our strategy. Esther, you were talking earlier about the law, and I love the law. So we also want to advance strategic cases and policy guardrails that embed non-discrimination and fair access to opportunities. So just to end this is basically we're in, as we all know, a really difficult time, and I think the Reverend that was speaking earlier, maybe he's, oh, there you are, yes. I'm a woman of faith, and having to do this work every day sometimes can be quite heavy, so I continue to pray about it. And I know that when, you see the growth of the far right and so on, I actually had to input some more hope in that we can't give up, we have to continue to push. And so now more than ever, reparations is a solution to global challenges and repairing trust with the global south, and is absolutely needed. Thank you very much.
We've got 10 minutes of questioning. I think I'm going to open the floor up, right, for anyone to ask anyone a question that's potentially been on the panel today. Everyone's names are within the list, so have a look. I'm going to open the floor up for questions. Who has a question and to whom?
Are you aware of what the Black Church did in 2014-15? Because they went down, they had a manifesto. I mean, are you aware of their manifestos?
Yes, we were aware of it, and we did have, a series of conversations with different groups, including the church. But it's important for us as an organisation to have those connections ourselves and to hear directly from people. So yeah, we were aware of what the church was.
But did you actually speak to the National Church Leaders Forum?
We did, and I think we attended an event that was hosted by Reverend Sharpton, who was here last year, I believe. OBV were hosting it. And yes, I met lots of ministers and pastors at the time. So yes.
And one of the things that I didn't hear mentioned yet by anyone, so I feel duty bound to mention this, apart from the obvious Bernie Grant, is the Rastafari movement community here in London, UK, started the largest march of 5,000 people, black people of all ages, on the 1st of August 2014. Yes? And it's very important, if we're serious and going to have a truthful conversation about the history of why we're here today, it's not because of individual profilers, it's because of the mass of people. Marcus Garvey said the greatest asset to his organisation was his membership. The greatest asset, and the reason why we're here today is because of the foot soldiers that are not in here that converged on Windrush Square in 2014. And just one quick point before I ask the question, please, to Claudia. Forever Family, a young black, regarded by Farage, who now is in Parliament as a black militia. Young black youth in 2020 turned that march around. I was contacted by Russian TV and international news TV here in London, UK, after my short clip went viral of these young, black, disciplined people that sent the white political left and right into absolute hysteria, okay? Referring to them as a black militia. So as you can see, I'm quite emotional and quite passionate about this. There's very much I have to add to this debate, but I'm conscious of the time. I've written a book in 2013, whole chapter about reparations and Queen Elizabeth's role in that. So I'd like to speak to those that are serious about education and reparative justice workshops, please, after. So my question now, thank you so much for allowing me to get that off my mind.
Elsa, that's
The question I would like to ask Claudia is, and again it's something that if we really do a serious study of Bernie Grant, we'll know that he also talked about repatriation as part of reparative justice. And there's many of us right now, myself included, all here, that want to leave. And we want to leave with our economic resources. We've had enough. I'm so sorry, I don't see a future where I'm going to spend another 10 years marching, or another 10 years debating, or another 10 years hoping that this society's changed. I've seen where I could go, but I want my economic reparations, and there's many of us that are not in this room that feel that today. So my question to you, please, Claudia, is, are you willing to discuss this as part of, not here and now, but we can arrange another discussion, as part of what Bernie Grant did also talk about as reparative justice, and the Rastafari community that, as I said, initiated that first march in 2014, have been calling for even before all of us were born. Thank you so much.
I mean, it's a difficult question in this context, and it was difficult when, at the time when Bernie Grant raised the issue of repatriation. Basically, that means voluntary removal of yourself from the colonized, the country that colonized us.
The mother country.
Well, this is not just a UK, would not just be a UK move, but it would be a move in America and everywhere else as well. So voluntary removal back to Africa, essentially, or India, and so on and so forth. The reality at the time, and I remember it well, is what we are facing today. We have a Farage, a far right, that is telling us to go. That is saying, quite frankly, that it wants to bring in policies that will say that you no longer have the indefinite right to remain, for example. And that, and back then, we still had immigration policies that weren't in our interest and wasn't going to recognize the historical contributions that we made, and wasn't going to recognize that this country is our country. Wasn't going to recognize that the debt, so-called debt we owed, we will not pay.
I understand that.
So the situation is, and I explained earlier, that the African Union is controlled and owned by the colonizers. And I explained earlier that I didn't explain it earlier, but what that therefore means, there's so many difficulties in that, is that are the 54 nations of Africa ready to receive us, even if that was our intended goal? Because certainly there's not even a clear free visa system between African nations. There is not a clear system that would engage us, because the countries themselves that we want to go to are not themselves liberated. Independence doesn't give us liberation. It doesn't feed us. It's not independence that we want, which is what we got. It does not feed us. What we need is reparations.
I'm not saying
what I'm suggesting is what we need is reparations before the stage of even considering repatriation, and that is the issue. We're in a climate where Africa has been underdeveloped. Britain has been overdeveloped as a result, and there's been no recognition.
How are you then making sure that there isn't corruption, if, as you call it, I think you called it a certain terminology, but how do we make sure that that money is going to the people who need it, especially given that activists are being arrested for raising their voices and speaking up about these topics. I know individuals like even myself where if I speak about this, I'm not going to be allowed to go and see my family again because the government is going to put me on a blacklist and I've been threatened about something like this. So I'm just really passionate about this topic because how do we begin to or what is your organization doing to begin to make sure that that money is really going to the people that you're saying that you want it to go to?
Yeah, it's a great question, and Zimbabwe is a really interesting example, and I'll give you one example. One of the things that we saw when we were looking specifically at Zimbabwe, there was a former leader of the country who used to take $5 million in cash, emergency money, onto the plane every time they went away. And they did that on the basis that Zimbabwe doesn't have a bank account in all these various countries. There may be a need to repatriate the president or his wife or anyone coming back. But every time he returned, he was supposed to return that $5 million to the central bank. And it was never returned, and nobody spoke up to say, excuse me, sir, you know that $5 million you took? Would you awfully mind returning? Nobody did that. So the question that you pose, though, is a really good one. So we term it as managed repatriation of funds. The first thing to remember is that any monies that are effectively stolen patrimony, we as an organisation, no matter who we are, and we're made up of different nationalities, different backgrounds, you can't have moral imperialism on how you return money. It belongs to the country, it belongs to the state. So what we do is we look at the country's 7-year economic plan, we look at their 5 priority areas, which are usually infrastructure, development, healthcare, sustainability, education, and we choose projects with the government, specifically where those funds go into. Those funds are monitored, as I mentioned, by civil society, and they're structured towards the very, very strict guidelines of the STAR program, which is the Stolen Asset Recovery Program of the World Bank. So it's very structured. I'll give you one example. $3 billion was returned by my colleague, a woman called Deborah Lapravette, and she was working with the Nigerian government, the Jersey government, and the US government. So $3 billion was returned, and it was put into projects like the Niger Delta Bridge, Ibadan-Lagos Expressway, and every single bag of cement, every single piece of steel that was made was absolutely monitored and written down. And it's a huge exercise in order to monitor it, but it can be done.
I think we've all learned something here today. Someone else's opinion, someone else's lived experience from Zimbabwe to Antigua, Guyana, Jamaica. I think that's what today's about. And I think, working together from parliamentary to business to finance, this is how the masses are waking up. From authors, from different people, from the Rastafarianism movement, coming to you, from all of these papers, documents, whether it be, grassroots social media stuff, workshops, or all the way to government level legislation, this is what it's about. This is why, when you make history, you don't realize that you're part of that history a lot of the time, but having this conference here today, this can be the start of bringing these great minds together for healing of this planet, healing of people. Yourself?
Just very briefly.
Yes.
I think the reason why and at the moment, British curriculum does not force the conversation about the transatlantic transportation of African people to be put into the curriculum. What is there is the Jewish Holocaust. We know that that's the kind of central kind of human rights story that has to be in the curriculum. But this story is not there. Now, at the moment, there is a big movement for the curriculum to be changed. There is a conversation going on. Unfortunately, I'm not particularly positive about whether that's going to come down the side of teaching this very important subject. But it's absolutely essential, I think. And Black Curriculum, by the way, is a brilliant organisation, working in education, pushing Black education and the history of Black organisations, is doing really good work to try and press this. But we need more work done. I think this is really, really crucial to our understanding of justice in the future.
I now invite the chair of ACSIS, David F. Roberts, to deliver a closing summary of today reflecting on today's key themes, and sharing the next steps of what the World Reparations Conference is going to look like. I'm Kridikel Truthbey. Thank you very much.
I'm really pleased. I'm ecstatic with the results. I don't have a prepared speech for this because I don't think it deserves a prepared speech. I think, you know, the results of today's presentations were amazing, to say the least. You know, when I look at the fact that this idea was born out of my attending the Pan-African Conference in May, that was coordinated in part by the Togo government, and I realized from some of the deliberations that there was a key component missing, and it was the young people, and where the young people featured in this whole movement of discussing reparations, reparative justice. And I thought, there's some people who should have been in the room that weren't there. And then someone asked me if I had any idea of Sir Hilary Beckles. And I said, well, yeah, of course. Sir Hilary Beckles is one of the pillars of the Caribbean effort. They said, well, we couldn't find him. I'm like, well, where did you look? Sir Hilary Beckles is, you know, he's reachable. Having said that, I invited him to this, but he couldn't make it. But I reached his office. You know, if you try hard enough, you can get where you need to go. And the Americans, this is somewhat appropriate. There's a saying in the hood in America, anybody can get got. Anybody can get got. No matter how much security you've got, no matter who you know in the establishment, if somebody wants to get you, they will get you, right? So this discussion here today is basically about not embarrassing people, not putting people on the spot. It's about finding a way to have a discourse about something that is deeply positive and in some ways difficult. Yeah, and I think we've proved it today. There've been no fights, nobody pelting paper cups at each other, nobody hurling, nobody hurling insults. You know, so I feel quite proud that we've managed to do this together, right? I was nervous as hell. I didn't sleep last night. You have no idea. I mean, I've been doing events for 21 years. In the diaspora, in other places, high commissions and whatnot. But this, I couldn't sleep. Where's Carol, my wife? That's my wife, actually. This took a lot. It took a lot. And I had some disappointments, I met a great individual in the person of Wale Hudson Roberts, who, introduced me to Richard, and Richard was the man behind making it possible. Richard, on one conversation, he just got it, and he just sent me names of people I've heard of, people I've never met, and I reached out to most of these people, and like 90% of them are here today, and it's not because I have been referred to as someone that they know in the community that has credibility to put on these things, but it's because of how I sold it to them. All right, yeah, I've come from a sales background, so yeah. But I think aside from the effort to sell them on the idea, they saw the merit of bringing us together to do something different, right? I had a bit of a disappointing experience this morning. Someone called me to say that they heard about the event. They were invited by a third party to come to the event. They're outside and they want to get in. So I said, well, did you contact us, the organizers, to get on the list? No, that doesn't matter. All right, okay. So do you have an invitation that we can put forward to the security of the House of Lords? No. You're missing the point. Tell me the point, sir. He's saying the point is I was invited. I heard about your event from someone who you invited, and they said I can come down and get in. So I said, well, look, the way it works at the House of Lords is that if you don't have your name on a written invitation that you can present to the security, you won't get in. Nah, you don't understand me what you talk about. What I'm saying to you is, I was told that this thing is happening and I need to be here. And I'm saying to you, well, yeah, I understand you need to be here, but there's a process. No, I'm not impressed. I'm not impressed with your process. Now that tells me that I'm speaking to someone who is obviously passionate about this subject, but they don't want to observe the protocol of getting into this place. And he's telling me that I need to use whatever it is that I used to get here in the first place to get him who's standing outside in real time into the room. And that's another thing in terms of mindset that we need to understand. You can't just roll up on the House of Lords and expect to get admitted, right? And this is all part of the whole issue of the mindset about things that we need to respect, things that we need to understand. And I think we've come to a general understanding here today that we can work together, right? We can sort out this whole thing about, the experience of the descendants of enslavers, us descendants of slavery. There's a conversation to be had. We can do it in dialogue. We've proved that today, that it is possible. So when I worked with the Black Equity Organization to put the report together, I'm going to ensure that we have most of the salient points that came out today. The points that were raised by the descendants of enslavers. We totally appreciate your sharing that experience with us, because a lot of us can't conceptualize what it is you guys feel. There's an obvious way to look at it, that they're extremely privileged. So what do they know about the struggles of the enslaved? You've shown us today that you have some appreciation of what it is we went through, and we appreciate that. Claudia came with some statistics that were amazing. Esther, we know we can always depend on her to give us the energy in terms of the effort and what it is in terms of legal, the legal ramifications of all of this stuff that we're doing. And my man at the back, Ibukun, I don't know how he does that job. That is extraordinarily, in my view, dangerous. It's like, it's hugely important for the countries that have suffered, the injustices of these corporate concerns. But what you're doing is amazing, man. It's amazing. So, Priya gave us a really good insight of the economic justice, and how countries are dealing with it, and what it is that what is possible in terms of how we can grasp the issues from an economic standpoint. Joseph, of course, he spoke about the legacies of enslavement and what the Guardian is doing and the scope of working together globally. All of that stuff is quite important. And Timmy, of course, was talking about, the reparations as a shared goal that we all should have. And I think this, as we've proved here today, that it's entirely possible that we can get to the point where, we're proud to talk about this 400-year-old legacy that's been bothering people for many years. And yeah, the fact that, Nigerians here send back £9 billion is a lot of money, and it just goes to show the size and the power of the diaspora, because the cumulative amount, could you imagine the cumulative amount of money from Ghanaians, Tanzanians, Barbadians, Guyanese, sending that back to their various countries? It's got to be in the hundreds of billions. So we are a force to reckon with. So we should have a platform to push these issues to get results. So we've created something really enormous here today, and I thank you. I thank my moderator, who, and it's fortuitous that we met 2 years ago, was it? in this house.
Yeah. On the balcony.
On the balcony, yeah. We met here by accident, even though he snubbed me when he met me first at reception. And I'm like, who's questionable? Who is this guy? I'm trying to say hello to the guy, and he's like, oh. Yeah, then someone said, yeah, he's excused because he's a TV star, you know. And then I got to meet him, and I realized he's just like me, you know, even more crazy than me. But yeah, but look, it's been great. I thank you. I thank my team. Well done. Fantastic. Of course, I thank my wife. Without her, this wouldn't have happened again. I thank all the speakers who took time out of their day. It didn't cost me a penny to get them here. And I really appreciate that. And what that means going forward is that we're going to have conversations about the conference. This isn't the conference. This is the launch of the conference. So any of you who want to be a part of the organizing committee, I've already co-opted my friend to help me organize it and put it all together. We want to start planning that for next year, right? We're going to get sponsors. We'll be able to pay speakers and do all of that good stuff. Yeah. But yes, we have work to do, right? So we're not just here as talking heads. At the end of this, as I said, I'll be speaking with our partners, the Black Equity Organization, to put a report together. We send it out to yourselves, and then we'll be looking for people to work with us to create the conference and make it an annual event, right? And see how we grow from this point. So with no further ado, I am going to close here, and thank you all again. You should give yourselves a round of applause. And let's go do the work.
It's really important to have as many conversations and discussions about policy moving forward towards achieving reparations. So I'm really pleased that this is happening here today in the House of Lords.
I think it went well today. I was pleased with the reception. I know that what we've got to say is not always kind of understood or necessarily the most welcomed people in the room. But I think being able to express how we feel and what we've done feels worthwhile. And I think the reception was good today. And in terms of bravery, it's not bravery that brings me here. It's a sense of responsibility. And I think what was said earlier on by Belle when she talked about apology being about accountability, I think that's absolutely at the centre of how I feel about this process. I don't come into this feeling either scared or brave. I just come in going, I'm just going to go and do what's right. I think it's as simple as that. I'm not a religious person, but I was brought up with a very strong sense of conscience and doing the right thing, and I think this is just part of that.
Yeah, having watched the video, it was very heartbreaking to see the history of what, or rather the labels that have been put or the price tags that have been put in terms of what we're owed, because it's definitely a lot more than the 300,000 that was being spoken about. And I think it really gets you to think, actually, what is injustice worth? What is it actually, what's the price tag you would put on that? Because I think if you start putting a price tag on it, it does start to feel a little bit like, yeah, it's just very painful. I think that was what I found.
It hasn't been easy. I mean, the subject matter is not an easy one. It's a difficult topic. But I think the level of debate is encouraging, and I think it augurs well for the conference which is due to take place next year. I think it's about maintaining the momentum. You know, the traction that we've got here, we want to take it forward. We want to try and bring on board everyone who's been here today. You know, reparations is a massive issue, but it's something that I think we can only achieve if we all work together. It's a justice issue, and I think it's just that we're in the House of Lords and we work together to try and bring this about. Yeah.
We've got to give more attention to the education of our communities, whether it be in the African diaspora or on the African continent, in regards to reparations and its importance, how it links the past, the present, and the future.
really pleased to have been here today. It's been a fantastic event to attend the World Reparations Conference. One of the key things for us is that we've got to work in collaboration and in partnership with ourselves. Reparations isn't just about the history, it's ensuring that it doesn't continue into the future. And it's also about making sure that the young people are also aware about the historic elements when it comes to reparations and why it remains part of a systems repair.